Hello everyone, good day to you all. Guess what it is time for? It's time for the new year, which means it's time for the Crystalis ranks every game he's played during the year tier list. So today we got a whopper for all of you today. I have a list of 40 games I've finished this year, which is the most number of games I've finished in a year since I started doing these tier lists. But not just that. That's also not including the games I didn't finish this year. So we have a lot to go through, so I need to get into it as soon as possible. Just a couple little quick house cleaning things before we get there though. First off, I live in a busy house. There will be background noise. I apologize, I won't cut around all of it, it'll happen. Second of all, I included a couple new features for the people who watch these videos instead of just listening to them, which is probably a very small number of you, but regardless, it might make things a little bit more convenient. In addition to the tags I already have, I have two new tags. One is a yellow tag, which I will put the approximate percentage of the game I completed if I didn't finish the game. Just a nice little reference thing for in case I forget to mention it while I'm talking about the actual game itself. And the second new feature is a red spoiler tag. So if I'm talking about spoilers for any of these games in particular that I think is worth kind of like, hey, don't listen to this. First of all, I have timestamps in the bottom of the video. You can skip around to whatever games you want to hear about or skip past a game I do talk about spoilers on. And I'll still warn you audioishly. I will speak if I am talking about spoilers, is what I'm trying to say. So you can skip around with the timestamps in the description. However, if you are watching this video on like your phone or a second monitor and it's open, you could possibly mute the video while I'm talking about the spoilers, so I still get the watch time, and then just keep the video open, and when you see that spoiler tag come off, you can unmute the video, or however. Did I say unmute before? I don't know. Who cares? I ain't gonna worry about it now. We gotta just go ahead with it. So let's get into it. And first order of business is a game that I actually did not play this year. It is unfinished business from the 2023 video where I forgot to include a game that I finished in that year. That game is a Highland Song. It came out at the very tail end of last year, so although I did play it and I did finish it, it slipped my mind and I forgot to put it in the actual list of the video. Oopsie doopsie. So a Highland Song is a Scottish developed game, if I am not mistaken. It'd be kind of weird if it wasn't, because it's set in Scotland, based in Scotland, all that jazz. It is not quite a platformer, not quite a visual novel. It is just kind of a 2D exploration game. The story of this one is that you're a young girl who is either running away from home or just leaving home to visit another member of her family on the other side of the Scottish Isles. It kind of depends on how you interpret the character, what dialogue choices you select. So that can be your own stamp on the story, but the main goal is just to get to the other side of the islands to visit your uncle before Beltane, which I'm not sure what Beltane exactly means in Scottish lore and tradition. I assume it's just like kind of like seasonal holiday sort of thing. But you have a week to get there in game time, and you do need to manage your time because you're a young girl. You get tired, you get hungry, you need to rest at certain points, and if you don't, then you're going to collapse and spend even more time recovering than you would have spent if you just took a few hours to sleep here and there, you know? So there is a bit of management that you need to do of your personal self. To be honest, didn't really love the game a ton. I unfortunately did not get to the uncle by the time of Beltane. I was a day late, so there's a slightly alternate ending, I'm assuming, if you were to actually get to your uncle by Beltane. I did not, and I didn't really feel compelled to play the game again to do that. I think the game works for what it is, I just did not find it extremely compelling. It does have very beautiful hand-drawn art. The music is lively and I believe pulls from like actual Scottish folk bands. It uses their music in the game because there are some sections in the game where you like run along a hillside and jump to the beat of a song along with the animals running with you. So it's kind of cute. It's kind of cute. And it's a cute game. I'd say it's a B tier, but it is not otherwise extremely notable. Next on the list is, I'm not sure exactly how to say this game, 1000X Resist. 1000 Resist, who knows? To be honest, this game is one that I did not finish this year, and I didn't even get that far into it because I did not care for it. I would say it is a C tier in my book, which is kind of surprising because I mean, it's a pretty niche game, but from everyone I've known who's played it, they loved it, and they said it was one of the best games this year. So maybe I just did not see what was so great about it. I made it through like the first chapter of the narrative, like excluding the prologue chapter, the first like actual real chapter. I just didn't vibe with the story the game was telling. I didn't vibe with the kind of game it was. Maybe this was on me. I think I kind of expected maybe a game that was somewhat closer to like somewhere between a Fury and a Nier Automata. So I guess I was expecting some kind of action game because you're resisting something, right? But it turns out there is no combat of any kind in this game. It is purely a narrative game, and it's a surreal narrative too. You have to be into the vibe, which I was not feeling at the time. So I made it through the first chapter, and I didn't care for it. So I looked onto the Steam reviews to see, am I missing something? Am I not thinking about this game the right way? And a general theme that I saw among other reviewers is, if you're not into the opening hours, you probably won't be into the rest of the game. So I took that as a sign to just drop out when I did. I wanted to like the game, but it didn't speak to me. So, oh well. Man, we're kind of on a downer, like, start to the list here. I didn't realize that when I was starting, and it's going to continue for a bit. So next up is Animal Well. Animal Well is another game I did not finish, but I wanted to play a little bit of because it was one of the highest rated games of the year, and I see why with this one, even though I did not get very far into it at all. It is best described as a Metroidvania, but there is no combat in this game. There is no like immediate challenge in front of you. There is survival. This is not a game I've played, but it is described to be very similar to it in concept, Rain World. So it is a Metroidvania type game where you go around and you have to actually accrue knowledge of the world, and you might get more abilities, but those abilities will not help you fight the monsters and the ghosts and the animals within this well that you're in. Your tools help you to explore, and you only really make progress by exploring. And what's really cool is finding secrets. Finding secrets is the kind of underlying challenge to the whole game. And the game does a really good job at funneling you into finding like secrets so you know what to look out for. So like it might drop you into a small little hole, and then when you do so, you're right next to an invisible wall, and that wall will reveal itself, and you can see there's a pathway beyond it. And that kind of gives you an idea of like what kind of things to look out for. And I heard this game gets really nutty with its secrets. So I really liked what I played, but I only wanted to play a little bit of it. And when I played that little bit, I was like, yep, that was enough for me. So yeah, I'll put it below Highland Song because at least I finished Highland Song, I suppose. All right, next up on the list is Another Code. Recollection, the remake that came out early this year for the Switch. So I first heard about Another Code through Smash Brothers. Big surprise there. I did not hear about the first two games when they originally released during their time. So when I saw Ashley's spirit in Smash Bros. Ultimate, I just went, who is this character? And then I went down a little bit of a rabbit hole and found out about Another Code and the series. So I'm like, interesting. And I never thought I would actually end up playing these games, but when it was announced that these games were getting a remake, then I became interested in it, and I wanted to try it out. And sadly, I didn't love it. Oh. I feel like the tier list interface is a bit choppier this year than it was last year. Whatever. I didn't love it. So this game is a sort of visual novel-y walking simulator-y. kind of game where you're solving an overall mystery of your father's disappearance, but you get some contact with him, but you don't meet him right away, and then your aunt goes missing, and your mother was dead the whole time. And then you go to investigate, and then you meet a ghost child who doesn't have any memories, and you're on a secluded island with no way to get off it at the time. So there's a lot going on, and it sets up a lot of interesting stuff, and the actual like gameplay mechanics and puzzle mechanics are kind of simple. You can tell that this was originally a DS game where the whole novelty was like you can use the touchscreen to manipulate objects, and there are some like cooler puzzles that were definitely a lot cooler on the DS. Like for example, if you've played The Legend of Zelda Phantom Hourglass and you know the one puzzle where you need to stamp your map, this was the game to do that before Phantom Hourglass. So if you know, you know. If you don't know, well, I guess you'll have to find out. So there's cool aspects of the game, but ultimately, and this goes for both chapters of the game or both games of the game, however you want to look at that, because this is a combination of the two Another Code games. Regardless, so both games, I think they set up a lot of really interesting ideas, and they're both really cool starting out, but I feel like the ultimate payoff for their mysteries is really boring and not interesting at all. And also don't really make a lot of sense. But that was just my opinion. This is one of those games where I got kind of into when I started out, played a lot of it, and then by the time I got towards the end of the first game, I kept dropping it because I wasn't particularly interested in the story. And when I finished it, I'm like, okay, this kind of ended not very satisfying to me. And then I got into the second game, and it was a lot better again starting out. I got really into it again, so I played a lot of it. And then I kind of fizzled out towards like the 60 to 70% mark for the second game. And then I kept dropping it over and over and over again until I finally finished it, where I felt the ultimate answer to the mystery was also very unsatisfying. Supposedly, from what I've read, the story is better written and makes more sense in the remake as opposed to the original. To what degree, I'm not certain of, but if I'm playing the improved version, I still wasn't into it. So that sucks. So I want to say I was disappointed by Another Code. I guess I just thought the games were going to resonate more with me, and then they ended up resonating with me in the end. But oh well. Yeah, kind of a depressing way to start the video with games I didn't finish or games that I just put what will end up being some of the lowest rated games of this year. So I guess we're just getting the bad stuff out of the way early, which is good. Let's start out getting up there with a game I really liked this time, Another Crab's Treasure. So Another Crab's Treasure is going to be our first A tier of the list. Might be a soft S tier. I guess we'll kind of see as we go along, but this game is really good. I was kind of shocked by how good this game ended up being. I heard a lot of really good things when it came out. I wasn't really particularly interested into it. I thought it was kind of just like a cute little gimmick, but then people really rallied behind it and said, yeah, the game's actually really fun and phenomenal to play. And it turns out, yeah, it is fun and phenomenal to play. It is a Souls-like game, but it has a bit of a faster pace with a bit more emphasis on the guarding mechanic, which is kind of wild because it's like it's combining Bloodborne and Dark Souls, and it's an odd combination, and it's also just like not your typical look for a Souls-like because it's very bright and colorful. And it does have like an actual active story that you're participating in, and it's not like you're just going into a world that's already faced the end. But anyway, game takes place in the ocean, and you're a hermit crab that does not have a shell anymore. So what you need to do instead to defend yourself is you need to pick up various trash along the ocean floor, and then you'll equip that onto yourself, and that will be your shell. And depending on what kind of trash you have equipped, whether it's like light, medium, or heavy weight, will depend on how far and how fast you can dodge out of the way of enemies. Because although dodging is riskier, if you're not getting hit, you're not losing health, you're not losing your shell. But if you don't think you can get out of the way, you can hide inside of your treasure or your trash or whatever. You can hide inside your shell, and then that is effectively your shield. So you won't take damage, but your shield will. And depending on the type of trash you have equipped on you, will determine how much durability and how much additional defense you're provided when wearing that shell. So there's like 60 different options of like trash you can pick up throughout the ocean floor, and it's pretty varied. A lot of them have like special abilities too, and most of those are kind of like the same. And that was kind of a point of disappointment for some, is that's like, oh, I wish all of these had a unique ability, but that is a pretty ridiculous ask, so whatever. But frankly, the combat is fun. It doesn't have like a great degree of customizations as a typical Souls game. Like, for example, you only get one weapon type, technically two, if you progress down one of your skill trees. So it's not like, you don't have a lot of weapon variety to choose from, and you're kind of just at the mercy of whatever shells you find along the way, although you can go back to pick up shells from previous areas if you liked one in particular, and you can like buy shells later at a certain point in the game. And the combat is challenging. It's not like ridiculously hard, but it is about as challenging as a regular Souls game. And what I also liked as well is the fact that there is a lot more agility involved in the game, not only for like dodging and stuff like that, but you can also jump around and you can float in the air for a little bit as you paddle around and swim. And that also opens up the avenue for this to be more of like a 3D platforming kind of game where you can jump and float towards different platforms, and you even get a grappling hook that you can use to latch onto like fish nets in the environment to climb up other grabbable type surfaces, and also that grappling hook can be used in combat to pull enemies towards you. So there's a lot going on, and the game feeds into itself very nicely. So yeah, it is a fun game, and I would recommend it. And its story in particular, I think, is also worth experiencing because it's kind of cute until you realize what the game is about. It's about us throwing trash in the ocean, and even more, I wouldn't say subtly, but it's an allegory on capitalism and how we allow this system to exist even though we don't like it, but we've built a society around it, and to change that society would make things a lot worse for us than trying to destroy it. And let's get into some spoilers for the end of the game, because I have a conflicting relationship with the ending of Another Crab's Treasure, where I think it is an unsatisfying ending to the story, and then I realize that's the point. I realize, oh yeah, us human beings are throwing trash in the ocean, and we're not getting angry enough about it. Which also reflects the journey of the protagonist, Krill, who is a hermit crab that just wants to exist, wants to be left alone, and then is kind of thrust and called into action into this underwater world where his ultimate goal is to just go back to the life he used to have, until he realizes he can't go back anymore. He is no longer ignorant to the world around him, and going back to that previous life is pointless. And no matter what he does, the world does not get better. There's going to be another crab after that treasure, and he's going to make the world miserable for everyone else anyway, no matter who he stops. So there is a lot of futility, and ironically, this very colorful game has one of the more depressing and more cynical endings of a game I've played in a while, which is... There's another game on this list I would like to compare to it, but I don't want to spoil that game either. So You know what? I'll let you figure that out for yourself. The ending to Another Crab's Treasure could be interpreted as similar to another game I'm going to talk about today, and they have two completely different takeaways for the ultimate message there, but we'll get to that later. Okay, so now we come to a huge one. We've got Astro Bot. I am so happy this game exists. If you saw last year's tier list video, I talked about Astro's Playroom because I played that for the first time. And Astro's Playroom was one of the big reasons I wanted a PlayStation 5. And that was because back in 2018, I played Astro Bot Rescue Mission for the PlayStation VR/PS4. And Astro Bot Rescue Mission is an incredible game. It's highly overlooked, understandably, because it's a VR game, but it was phenomenal. Astro Bot Rescue Mission is one of my favorite games among like PlayStation's entire library across all of their systems. That game is that good. And then Astro's Playroom scratched an itch. It scratched an itch, but it wasn't quite there. I wanted a game that was Astro Bot Rescue Mission, but not in VR, so that everyone could play it and everyone could experience it, and it'd be a full-fledged $60 release video game that people could just buy and play and have a good time with. And Astro Bot delivered. This game is so good. This game is ridiculously good. Like, a lot of comparisons have been made to Mario games, in particular Mario Galaxy, that Astro Bot is like the lost Mario Galaxy 3 we never got, which is absolutely true and I think is an apt comparison. But also, just the fact that it's so ridiculously polished as it is. This rivals the quality of a lot of Nintendo games out there. It is that good. And Nintendo is like some of the best game makers in the biz. So to have any game even come remotely close to that level of quality and polish is a feat on its own. But Team Asobi has the chops for it. They know how to make it work. They're experienced. I think more experienced than people gave them credit for, because they're like, oh, Astro Bot is the sequel to the tech demo Astro's Playroom on PS5 when it launched with the system. But it's more than that. I think a lot of people forgot or don't know about Astro Bot Rescue Mission, understandably, because they haven't played it, because it's not very accessible. But they've already proven they could do this, and they still exceeded expectations. In fact, they did such a good job that Astro Bot is my game of the year. Oh yeah, we're getting into it already. Astro Bot is so good. The level designs are incredible. There's a lot of different various level themes, and they're all very short, but they pack everything into the idea that they need to. In general, Astro Bot is kind of a shorter game. It's like a 10-hour-ish game for just a casual playthrough, a little bit less than 20 if you're doing completionist and getting all the trophies and whatever. So it's not a long game, but it is exactly the perfect length, and it crams everything it needs to in that time. And Captain Astro moves perfectly, and the music, no surprise, is incredible for an Astro Bot game. Although there's a lot of reused songs from Rescue Mission and Playroom, those were banger songs, first of all, and second of all, there's still enough new in here that it still is incredible anyway. And speaking of levels, this game also includes 5, not like bonus levels because they are required to beat the game, but 5 special levels that are all based on a certain game franchise from the history of PlayStation. In fact, you know what? I'm going to throw up the spoiler tag right now for this one. I want to talk about those cameo levels, and I want to talk about how they made me feel, and I'll probably just also get into like the end game while I'm at it right now. So the PlayStation levels are based off of each era of PlayStation's history. So in the first world, we have a PlayStation 1 originating character, and a PlayStation 2 originating character in the second Galaxy, and then a PlayStation 3, a PSP one, and a PS4 one. So first off is Ape Escape, which is a wonderful one to get off on, because Ape Escape I feel like is kind of not very remembered very well. I mean, if you grew up with it, or you're a little bit older of a gamer, you know what Ape Escape is, but I imagine anyone under the age of like 18 probably doesn't know what Ape Escape is. But also it just kind of fits. That game was a platformer collectathon kind of game as well. Astro Bot is a platformer collectathon kind of game as well. And then you get a net in that level, and then you get to catch the monkeys, and it's great. It reminds you very much of Ape Escape, and it almost feels like Team Asabi was begging Sony to just let them make an Ape Escape game. But then you could argue that for any one of these cameo levels. The next one after that is the God of War level. And if they do have to criticize it in this way, the way they chose to represent God of War is through its PS4 reboot of the God of War series, where it takes place within Norse mythology. But there's not another level in the game that harkens back to specifically PlayStation 2. In fact, if there was even like a section in the level where it referenced the Greek stuff a lot more directly, I would even accept that much. But because of that, we technically have like 2 PS4 franchises represented instead of a PlayStation 2 series. So I found that to be unfortunate. I would have preferred if they referenced the Greek stuff more directly. I don't think Sony would have greenlit that anyway, so whatever. But that was fun. You get the Leviathan axe, and you get to throw it and recall it just like in the game, and it's just as fun in Astro Bot as it is in God of War, so that's cool. Next up is the Uncharted level, which is probably my least favorite of the cameo levels, if I'm being frank, because it's not that interesting. It works for like the platforming aspect, and Uncharted was probably the premier series of Sony and PlayStation on the PS3. So yeah, I represent that series. That makes sense. But I think the level kind of didn't do enough interesting in the gimmick of just shooting a gun, especially since it autocorrects and there's no like covering and ducking out of cover like in the Uncharted games. Not that there really needed to be, but it feels like there's a kind of piece of the identity missing for Uncharted. And then next up is Loco Roco, which I did not know was going to be in the game, and I was ecstatic when I saw it. And although I had not played a Loco Roco game before Astro Bot, I felt like it perfectly encapsulated what that series is about and what makes it so appealing and fun. And I played a little bit of Loco Roco 1 afterwards, and frankly, that one level in Astro Bot is the best Loco Roco game I think we've ever gotten. But that just made me so happy that something so overlooked as Loco Roco got that level of love and appreciation. And then, of course, the Horizon one, which I feel like people are kind of down on Horizon. Not like I'm super up on Horizon either. But regardless, the Astro Bot level did a good job of showing what made that series so special with its bow and arrow mechanics. And I do kind of wish that, because when you hold down the trigger, it'll like slow down the action and focus in and put up a reticle. I kind of wish like you could just freely fire the bow and arrow normally, and then maybe press the other trigger to like slow down and focus if you need to. Very minor criticism on that one. It's whatever. But all of those levels were so fun. They demonstrated the fun of PlayStation, and not to mention so many just regular Astro Bot cameos of all the different regular bots, friendly bots in different costumes of PlayStation characters from across the history, including staple third-party releases of the most important games on PlayStation throughout the years. Some people will be like, oh, that's just Sony wanting you to remember all these franchises so you buy product. I don't think it is. I think all that stuff was included because Team Asabi loves video games. They included all that stuff because they want to celebrate video games. And video games are good. Video games are good. and they're special, and it's so good. And it made me aware of a lot more games I've never played before, or there were even obscure costume picks in there from games and series I could not immediately recognize. Like, when I looked them up, I'll be like, oh, okay, yeah, that game, that makes sense. There were a few I don't think I heard about before, to be honest. But, I mean, when you stump a game lore enthusiast like me with some of your picks, you've done an incredible job picking the famous ones, but also the obscure ones. And for the obscure ones, it made me want to go play those games and franchises. And that's kind of what I did. Is you'll notice a lot more games on this list that are PlayStation franchises, and those are just the ones that I finished. I sampled a whole bunch of other ones too, which won't be on the list because I only played like 5% of them, and not enough to talk about. But Astro Bot is incredible. It's a fun game that makes you love video games, and what especially will make you cry is that final level of Play Squadron Go, where you're playing a space shooter segment where all the different Astrobots and all their costumes get on their respective consoles and controllers and accessories and pilot their ships as you take down the final boss with the power of good video games at your side. I'm almost welling up thinking about it. It's not nostalgia. It's just a love of video games. That's all it is. That's all it is. And it's a very incredible game. All right. Oh my god. Go play Astro Bot if you have the chance to and have not. It is worth it. All right, next up on the list, Balatro. Balatro is going to be our first S tier, easiest S tier of the list. So, I don't like card games. I don't like deck builders. You have a very difficult time if you're trying to convince me to play a card game. I can't count cards. I don't get strategies and synergies. Like, I mean, I can enjoy a good hand of like poker or blackjack. Certain card games, I like physical tabletop card games, I can get behind, but if you're asking me to like construct a deck, you have a very hard time selling me on your game. You know, as another game genre I also don't like, roguelites. I am a person that likes stories, like more definable stories. I am a person that likes progression. I do not like the feeling of my progress being lost. So if you're trying to sell me on a card deck building roguelike game, you're having an uphill battle on that one. And Balatro kind of snuck in at the very last minute of this year. I played it because it's like, highly acclaimed game. I want to at least try it. And then I got addicted pretty much immediately. What I think is interesting about Balatro is I think that describing the game as a roguelike and as a deck builder, while true, is kind of, I don't want to say disingenuous, but I think that kind of oversells those aspects of the game. I think it's just a fun card game. I think if you were to kind of translate its concepts into an actual real life card game, which I know it was based on a real card game, or loosely interpreted from the rules of that game. So, I mean, I guess you could technically play Balatro in real life. But I mean, like, if you were to just introduce someone the concept of Balatro with a tabletop set of cards, I think they would kind of get it. I think they would see the appeal of it. But I think what really makes it important as a video game is the Joker aspect, and using different Jokers to multiply the score that each hand provides, and those scores get to such ridiculously high, incomprehensible numbers that it really can only work as a video game, because imagine trying to math that out. Like, imagine rolling a d20 every time you wanted to, like, calculate a lucky card on a real-life playing tabletop. Now that I think about it, has someone not already made, like, a Balatro, at least a proof of concept if nothing else, a tabletop, actual, physical, card-based Balatro? I don't know. But it's so fun. It is so fun. And I'd never really felt the aspect of, I'm losing progress if I fail a run. I don't feel that way. It just kind of makes for an easy game to just boot up quickly, play for however long I want to, whether that's 10 minutes, whether that's an hour, whether that's 5 hours. And then I could play it on my PC, which I prefer. I could play on my phone when I want it to be a little bit more quick. Because yeah, apparently I loved Balatro so much that I also bought it on my phone. So that's that. I don't think I have too much more to say about it. If you've played Balatro, I imagine you probably love Balatro, and if you love Balatro, you know why you love Balatro. It's just fun. It's just fun. That's all it is to it. Alright, so next up is the Beginner's Guide. This game came out a long time ago, probably 10 years or longer ago, and it was actually the first game this year that I played through. It's not an exceptionally long game. I think it only takes like 3-ish hours to beat. And the story for this game, for those who are not aware, is one of the creators of the Stanley Parable. I want to say his name is like Davey something. To be honest, I don't remember. But he made this game. Well, that's not accurate. Let's just say, let's go back and say that he compiled this game, and he wanted to show off a lot of the projects that inspired him to start making games. And that's kind of why I want to play this game. Is I am a aspiring game developer. That is a hobby I want to get into in the future. So I wanted to play a game that kind of goes over someone's struggles with the creative process side of making games. So the game was recommended to me for that reason, and I was interested in it. And before we go on further, I'm just going to throw up the spoiler tag right away, because I think if I say anything more, because of how short the game is and because of how focused in on the message it ultimately is, if you are at all interested in playing it, it is best to not know about any of that going in. So spoiler tag up, and let's talk about it. So the game is a compilation, not necessarily of Davey's work, but one of his friends from either college or high school, or I think college sounds right. He compiled a lot of his games together. Someone who is not making games anymore, from Davey's words, got burnt out and didn't want to do it anymore. But Davey wanted to compile it together and showcase kind of what made his thought process so unique and his approach to designing games so unique. And the friend's name is Coda, if I did not already mention that before. So Coda and Davey being the one experiencing most of these and Coda being the developer. So none of these games, if I remember correctly, were at all designed by Davey. They were all designed by this Coda friend. So Coda would make a game, and maybe sometimes like there'd be a weird bug and something didn't work out quite right, or he would design something in a slightly odd way that kind of just made sense to him, but was viewed as esoteric by Davey. So Davey would give him feedback, but the big takeaway is that Davey loved the games that Coda made. And Davey was always looking for the story underneath them, and was always looking for the director's intent, the creator's intent behind the stuff that Coda made. But you can kind of tell as the works progressed, Coda became kind of frustrated because he was getting this feedback and applying it, but it was kind of going against his own vision for what these were, or at worst case scenarios, Davey was applying meaning or attributing meaning to works that Coda was not intending at all. For example, it's kind of hard to tell by the small image, but the light or the lamppost, which is kind of the signature centerpiece of the game, he puts a lamppost at all those at the very end of the game, and Davey is convinced that they mean something, but in Coda's mind, they likely just signify this is the end of the game. And that's all there is to it. So as the games progress, they get even more complex and more complicated and less enjoyable, if we're being frank, or if I'm being subjective about it, if I'm being honest. They get less enjoyable, and you can see the straining relationship between Davey and Coda. Davey being convinced that Coda's making masterpieces, and he needs to keep making games, and he needs to keep applying this feedback because it's important. If he's making games like this, he needs the feedback. And then Coda clearly pushing back against Davey and applying that feedback in the worst faith possible. And it all culminates in the most miserable game maybe ever made that is not intended to be won against by normal means. So Davey hacks it for the player just to showcase, and making it to the end of the game is when Davey discovers that he effectively ruined his relationship with Coda, that Coda doesn't want to see him anymore, doesn't want to talk to him anymore, that Davey ruined all the fun of making games by giving him this feedback and attributing meaning to things where there was not meaning. And it felt real, and it felt really bad. And by the time I got to that point in the game, I was like, I don't think I should like playing this game. I think I should have stopped. I should stop playing this game right now. And I feel like unethical playing this game, and not like to that devious of an extent. But then the beginner's guide becomes a confession by Davey that he really pushed his friend to a limit he shouldn't have, and this was an apology video and him wanting to connect with this friend again and just throwing his games out there as a compilation to hopefully try and reconnect with him. And even then, I'm like, this should be between you and him, man. You should not throw the rest of the world into your argument with him. So that's what made me feel bad about it. Now, full disclosure, that's just a narrative. That's just a story. Davey is real, but Coda is likely a fictional character. If Coda wasn't, and Davey just published all of Coda's games that he said he doesn't want Coda to modify or touch or do anything with or attribute that meaning to, he would have gotten his ass sued into the ground. So that was just a fictionalized narrative, but it was probably reflecting a lot of Davey's feelings from after the Stanley Parable. Okay, I made this really weird, really meta, really wild, oddball game. How do I keep making games anymore? How do I take the feedback, and how do I interpret all this meaning that people have attributed to the Stanley Parable that was probably not intended to be thought about in those ways? So once I came to terms with like the story of the game was fictionalized, then I began to retroactively enjoy it again. And I do think it poses a lot of interesting like thought processes and like considerations for when I go on to eventually make games, because I apologize for the dogs. They are barking up a storm right now. Be careful about feedback. Be careful about what you choose to implement, and don't feel bad about including some oddball ideas, and don't feel bad about including things that don't actually have meaning. So I think there's a lot of interesting things to think about. If I finished this any later in the year, I probably would have dumped this into S, but I think because it's been so long since I played it, I haven't been thinking about it all that much. So I think I'm going to drop it down to A tier. And that'll be that for now, because it's not like a game I thought all that much about after I finished it. Although I do think about it sometimes. Next up is Berserk Boy, and Berserk Boy is another not finished. It's another C tier. It was just kind of one of those games I took a chance on, but when I did, you know when you play a game and yes, you play it for a little bit, and you can just feel that something's off? That's how I felt about Berserk Boy. So Berserk Boy has a vibe that is very reminiscent to me of the Mega Man ZX games, which were games I did not play for myself, if I'm being honest, but I don't know, I just wanted to give it a chance. It looked like a fun little indie pixel art kind of game. Just could not vibe with it. Something about the controls, the way Berserk Boy moved, the way combo works, the way level design worked, I don't know. It felt wrong playing it immediately. So this is probably the game on this list I have invested the least amount of time into, relatively speaking. So, really not much more to comment on. Game I didn't enjoy, and that's all there really is to it. Oopsie daisy. But I didn't refund it because I feel bad about refunding indie games. So, oh well, just wasn't for me. That's how life goes sometimes. Alright, Cadence of Hyrule is a game I've already finished. I finished it when it came out back in 2019, and fun detail about that, not only does it mark the 5-year anniversary since I last played it, but the context for which I played it in the first time is the same as when I played it the first time. So 5 years ago, in 2019, I went on a vacation with my family to South Dakota, and in that trip, we went and drove down to Wyoming, wherever it is in Wyoming, to see the Devil's Tower, like rock formation. And along that road trip, because it was a long trip, I played Cadence of Hyrule on the way there and back. And in 2024, 5 years later, I went back to South Dakota to see the Badlands again, and we took a day to drive out to the Devil's Tower rock formation again. Although the day we went, the park was closed because there was a fire, so we could not get in despite driving all that way. Regardless, we drove all that way there and back, and along the way, I played Cadence of Hyrule again, so I got to relive the memories and the context all in that time. So maybe in 2029, I'll do it again. Who knows? But that was fun. And Cadence of Hyrule, I like a lot more than Crypt of the Necrodancer. Crypt of the Necrodancer is a game I want to like, and the vibes are there. I just can't get into it because roguelike, so that's unfortunate. But it turns out those concepts work expertly, mix so well with me if you put it into an adventure game context. So it's kind of more roguelite instead of roguelike if we're talking about genres. So there's a lot more permanent progress to be made in Cadence of Hyrule. And to be honest, the game is a lot easier than Crypt of the Necrodancer. One of my friends who loves Crypt of the Necrodancer was telling me, yeah, I like Cadence of Hyrule, but it's just too easy. It's just too easy, but I don't know. I like that it's too easy, I guess. It's a lot more accessible to get into than Necrodancer is. And there is a lot of nostalgia for the Zelda series packed in there, of course, but it also does a lot of new things on its own to differentiate itself from the overall series, and it also finds creative ways to mix in the main series stuff with the musical theming. Like, all the bosses are a regular Zelda enemy, but wielding an instrument that is phonetically similar to their name. Like the Glockenspiel, or the, I can't think of any of the other names. It's been half a year, I don't know. Cut me some slack. But yeah, it's a game I like. I say it's an A tier, maybe a B tier. I don't know. We'll see how I'm feeling about it. I liked it more than Beginner's Guide. Yeah, that works. Okay. Next up on the list is Castaway, and Castaway might be the most disappointed I've been in a game this year, which feels real bad to say. So I found out about it a month or two before it came out. I looked at it and I'm like, okay, it's just a Zelda clone, but you know what? I could get into a game like that. And when it came out unexpectedly. I don't know if it shadow dropped, but I found out it was releasing not long before it actually did. So I'm like, oh, I'll get it, I'll play it. And when I finished it, because it takes about a half hour to finish, I kept thinking, wait, that was really it? That was the whole game? So what the game is advertised as is a bite-sized Zelda-like adventure. And after you finish the main game, there is an additional post-game chapter, which is more of a roguelike type of, you go into a tower and the floors are randomly generated and you try to reach the top and fight a boss up there. Despite that, you can see all the content this game has to offer within an hour, if you're playing it kinda slow. So this is an exceedingly short game. So although it's advertised as a bite-sized Zelda adventure, from my perspective, you're getting a crumb-sized Zelda adventure. And it's not like it's introducing ideas that you haven't seen before in other Zelda games. Like, your items are like a hook shot and bombs, and a sword is your main attack. And there's nothing there that makes it feel all that distinct from Zelda. and it goes by really fast. And the roguelike aspect, secondary chapter, is at least something, but it's not extensive enough to really extend the value of a game, and which is kind of where I think my biggest problem with Castaway lies, is this game offers up very little value for the price you paid. Now, I paid, I think, $8 for it at launch, and as much as I don't want to be that dollar per hour guy, because I don't think it matters that much how much a game costs as long as it really provides a valuable experience. But like I just said, I think this is one of the least valuable purchases for your dollar you could get in terms of the gaming space. There are many other games that are just a couple dollars more expensive, or in some cases a couple dollars cheaper, and you get a more fulfilling product than Castaway offers. So this game got me to do something I don't normally do. I wrote a negative review on Steam where I aired all these same grievances that I'm now going to be laying out for you right now. And what I feel bad about is one of the creators of the game responded to my review and said, "Hey, thanks for the feedback. We improved some things. I hope you enjoy it a little bit better now." And now I feel bad. Now I feel bad because I ragged on their vision. But I mean, that's kind of the thing you need to accept if you're going to be an indie game developer or a game developer in general, is you might not make a banger, and there is a risk of the thing you make just turns out to not be very beloved. Now, I think the reviews have risen up a little bit. I think they did make the game better. I've not personally gone back to play it since it launched. So this review, this little segment of the video, is a reflection of the game when I played it back in June or August or whenever it launched, sometime during the summer. But yeah, I wasn't expecting much, and yet I expected more than what the game offered, and that is my ultimate stance on it. Next up on the list is Castaway Colony. And this is another game made by friend of the show, Nathan Wooten, by Bushido Studio, or Bushido Productions, I forget what the studio name is. So this is their second game, their follow-up game to the previous Toaster Defense, which we talked about a couple years ago on this show, which I think I put in the lowest of B tier. And Nathan Wooten was like, hopefully we can get a little bit higher than a B tier next time, because it's more than I deserve. So Cast Out Colony came out, and this is still in early access if I am not mistaken, so it is not content complete, but feature complete if I am not mistaken. And guess what? You're busting out of the B tier with this one. I think Castaway Colony is an A tier video game. So this game is a mix between Vampire Survivors and Cult of the Lamb. I've played games that are similar to both of those, but not those exact games. So in what way this combines of those two, I cannot tell you. However, it is enjoyable. So it is kind of one of those like horde battles, survive for as long as you can until the end of a run, which is, I don't know if there's a set time limit, like in 20 minutes till dawn, but however long 16 waves or 12 waves, depending on the map size, how long that lasts. And there's a few different characters that you can use that have their own baseline attacks, and then as you gain levels, you can get different attacks and different passive abilities that do different things for you. You get stronger in the run, but of course more enemies also spawn as the run progresses, so it becomes harder to manage that. So it all comes down to the right gear and equipment and building out a synergized loadout that makes sense for the character you're controlling, the weapons you have, and the passives you have. So it all works together quite nicely, and I felt like the weapons and abilities were balanced reasonably well. There were definitely some weapons I favored over others, but I could generally make any weapon work, provided I also found the right skills that made sense for them. But what I really loved, especially about this game, is that there is also aspects of permanent progression, because after you do a nighttime defending of your colony, you get to go back into the colony and you get to build it up. You get to build different buildings that give you different stats inherently just by them being up. Depending on how much you fit in your community, you can get more stats and more like bonus levels that you can carry over into your run to make that your run a little bit easier. And some of the harder difficulties definitely rely on you building up a community. And although it was definitely kind of janky and buggy, and the interface could have been a lot more user-friendly, especially with the controller, which is what I played with, it is serviceable enough that I found it enjoyable. And it just made for a compelling gameplay loop. I got pretty addicted to this game. Now, that being said, when I got all the achievements that were in the game at the time, that's kind of where I stopped. Eventually, a few more characters got added, and then a few more difficulties got added onto that as well. And I tried out for a little bit, but the highest difficulties are extremely punishing and extremely hard right out of the gate. So I was just like, yeah, I'm just gonna leave that aside. But the game itself is really fun, and I think if you're into Vampire Survivors or 20 Minutes Till Dawn or those kinds of games, this is one that you should definitely check out. Again, I can't really speak for how well the genre blending works, but I can tell you the combination does sit well with me, so it is worth checking out. Content warning is the next in line of what I like to call the genre of a group of people going into a unsettling environment to collect something and then escape with your lives. So content warning is kind of in that line. In the line of like games like Phasmophobia or Lethal Company, so it is kind of within that subgenre of video game. But that's not a subgenre I could particularly liked before until Content Warning. Content Warning is an immensely enjoyable game. I'd say that is a reasonable spot for it. So what I like about Content Warning is that its gameplay loop is a lot more easy to understand. I think like Lethal Company in particular, it's like, well, Lethal Company, it's like, okay, go into the world to get scrap. What does the scrap do for me? Nothing, you just gotta collect it. Oh, okay, so you collect scrap and then hopefully it's enough, and if it's not, game over, I guess. In Phasmophobia, it's like, okay, we gotta go figure out and identify this ghost. I'm like, great. So what do we do when we identify the ghost? Oh, nothing really. We just gotta figure out what kind of ghost it is and leave. I'm like, really? That's it? That's the whole game loop? So I found those games to be kind of confusing and vague in their objectives. But Content Warning is, okay, here's this camera, go into this spooky place and capture footage of spooky monsters. Okay, I understand that. But what does that do for me? Oh, if you make a lot of footage of spooky monsters and make really compelling videos, you'll get more views on your videos. Okay, well, what does that do for me? Oh, well, the more views on your videos, the more money you can spend. And what can you do with the money? Oh, you can spend it on equipment to make better videos. Okay, that makes sense to me. I get that. I get it. Oh my goodness, a compelling gameplay loop. But also, what makes it challenging is you have a very fluid and floppy movement, so it's kind of hard to get shots exactly how you want them. Monsters are scary and they can trap you, so there's a risk to going down and confronting those monsters. But the most important part is that you just get the camera out of there. So if you get the camera out of there, you have the footage for the video you can post that night. If you don't, and if you fail, there goes one of your days, there goes your entire day's worth of work and footage. So this is just kind of one of those games where the monsters are kind of actually unsettling and they will trap you, and it is kind of scary and spooky. So there is definitely a horror-ish aspect to it. So this game can be as scary as you want it to be. But depending on the group of friends you play with, it can also be as silly as you want it to be. And every video you make will have your own little kind of imprint on it. It'll be uniquely yours. It's not just any scrap you find in the wild. It's not just any ghost you identify. It is uniquely your video. And you can even download the videos that you make to your computer and then share those on Twitter or YouTube or whatever. It makes for a game that is very communable and shareable and just fun to play. No, it's not like a game I spent hours and hours and hours playing throughout the year. It's not like I It's not like I invested a lot of time into it, but I really enjoyed all the time I did invest into it, and I remember it very fondly. Okay, Cryptmaster is another game I didn't finish. I don't think I got very far into this one either, but I also really enjoyed playing this one a lot. So what makes this game kind of so special is that you are a group of adventurers who have died, and I think you're trying to make your way out of the underworld and back into life again. I don't really remember the actual story of this game that well, but you're being guided by the Cryptmaster, who is kind of like a dungeon master-ish kind of figure, who kind of gives you hints and guides you, but maybe is an unreliable narrator, maybe, I don't know, he kind of makes fun of you if you make really stupid decisions. So it's kind of neat. It's got a very interesting art style where it is completely composed of black, white, and gray colors. There is no actual color to be found. It's like Mad World, except not even with red. But what makes it especially unique as a game is that instead of just doing regular dungeon crawling, because it is a first-person dungeon crawler as its genre, when you encounter enemies or when you do actions in the overworld, you need to manually type them out on your keyboard as if it's like typing of the dead. So your characters can have different like attacking abilities, and they all have different cooldowns, so you gotta type in like hit or sneak or block or whatever. And so you're constantly typing different words on the keyboard, and it kind of feels like a really old school, from the late 90s, early 2000s kind of computer game. It has that vibe to it. So it feels kind of like classical and nostalgic and fun despite being new. Again, I wish I played more of this game. Unfortunately, it just didn't work out that way this year. But I really liked it. So give it a consideration if you're ever looking into something that, if you're on PC and looking for something that feels a little unique. Crystalis is one of my favorite games on the NES, asterisk, because I've never finished it before. In fact, I don't think I even got that far into it. I think the farthest I ever made it is like 25-ish% of the game through, and I almost finished it this year. I just got to the very end and time ran out. If I had allocated a lot more time to it earlier, I probably could have finished it. Oopsie doopsie, oh well. That's just how life goes. So I did not end up finishing it. I still like Crystalis quite a lot. Maybe not quite as much as I used to, because I think the first couple hours of Crystalis are a lot of fun. It's just, as the game progresses, it becomes a little bit more obtuse. It becomes a lot more open and confusing. It becomes a lot more difficult. And you can hit the level cap of the game surprisingly early. Like, there's only 16 levels in the game, and I hit level 16 probably around halfway through the game. Granted, there were times I was just grinding, but I was kind of compelled to grind because it's a difficult NES RPG where you don't have like a lot of invincibility time and enemies hit for really high damage. So I wanted to get levels and I want to get money to afford better armor and stuff. So it is kind of difficult, but it is reasonably charming. I don't think this is one of those games where you need to go seek it out, like hidden. Well, I would argue it is a hidden gem of the NES, of course, but not like a high priority title that you need to play. But I don't know, it just vibes. It inspires me a little bit. I hope I could make a video game that is at least somewhat like Crystalis in the future. Who knows? Like I have a dream of an action RPG-esque kind of game. And maybe it'll take some cues from Crystalis. Who knows? All right, next up we have Dark Souls. Specifically Dark Souls Remastered, because that was the version I have and the version I played. Dark Souls Remastered on the PS4, I guess, if that even makes more of a difference to you. So, in the GOTY is not just reserved for the game of this year, it is also reserved for the best game I played this year, which did not come out this year. And one other aspect of the category, which we will get to later in the video. But I guess not so subtly putting it out there, Dark Souls is in fact my game of the year for a game that did not come out this year. So I have a bit of a history with Dark Souls. You could say it's the chocolate milk of video games. So Dark Souls is a game I first played back in 2014 with the Prepare to Die PC version, which is very janky and horrible and was like running off Windows Live at the time. Who knows? It's a whole thing. I don't want to get into it because I don't know it that well. But I did not like Dark Souls at the time. I thought it was a very clunky, very obtuse, and very difficult game that did not provide a lot of satisfying feedback. And people loved it for some reason, and I just assumed they were crazy. But as the years progressed by a little bit, more people came out and expressed their love for Dark Souls, and the sequels came out, which were also very well acclaimed, and it made me think, maybe I was wrong about Dark Souls. So the next time I tried Dark Souls in like 2016 to 2017, that period, I found more enjoyment than I did previously. I made it farther than I had before, and I would say I liked the game at the time, not loved it, but I certainly did kind of understand more of the appeal, but I didn't necessarily intend to finish at the time, and I didn't really care to do more than get to Sen's Fortress, which is where I originally stopped. And I think coming back to it now, I can kind of see why I stopped at Sen's Fortress. But regardless, that's how I felt at the time. And then a few years pass, Remastered comes out, and then I pick up Remastered because it was bundled with the rest of the Dark Souls trilogy for a pretty good price. I picked that up, and again, I kind of like it a little bit more than before. I know a little bit more about Dark Souls kind of from osmosis, so with a little bit more knowledge equipped, Dark Souls became a bit more enjoyable. Again, I don't think I made it farther than Sen's Fortress, if I even made it that far at the time, and then I dropped it again. But something about Dark Souls just kind of spoke to me this year. So I started up my playthrough again, and then I finished it. I finished all of Dark Souls. I got really invested into it, and I had a great time with it. Dark Souls is one of those games, I think I just alluded to it, but the more you know about Dark Souls and the more knowledge you have of its world and of its mechanics and of its level design, I do think it becomes more enjoyable. I think it is kind of hard to discover a lot of that stuff by yourself. I don't know if I ever would have finished this game had I not implicitly known a lot of those details. But regardless, I do know those details, and I did use them to my advantage this time, and it made for a lot more enjoyable of an experience. And it's one of those games I just kind of couldn't get enough of. Even after I finished it, I went back to play it again. I created new characters with different classes, and I experimented with those. I don't know if I ever finished those alternate characters, but funny, I was talking about the South Dakota trip I took with my friends earlier with Cadence of Hyrule. During that South Dakota trip, during the nights and the early mornings, we were playing Dark Souls together on a level 1 run. So there's a lot of ways you can approach and play Dark Souls, and there's a lot of freedom with its customization, and not to mention its lore and its storytelling, a story I previously could not give two craps about before because it was not a story directly told to you. I suddenly got invested in the lore of Dark Souls. Not that I was reading item descriptions every time I found a new one, but I went to look up the Vati videos and all the backlog of great Souls content that I was missing out on all these years. And I'm like, oh, this story is actually pretty interesting now that I actually know what it's about. So yeah, I also did the main game, I did the DLCs too. I was slightly disappointed by the DLC actually. Based on how highly revered it is, I thought it was going to be way more extensive and had way more bosses than there actually ended up being. So I'm like, when I finished the DLC, I'm like, oh, that was it? Oh, interesting. But yeah, Dark Souls I fell in love with. Is one of those games I could not stop thinking about after I was playing it, and kept playing it because I was enjoying it that much. I make a joke in these tier list videos that I play through at least one series every single year, the whole series, and I intended to do that for the Souls games, but due to timing and due to not having as much time as I wanted to, that did not end up panning through. But we do have another Souls game to talk about right now, which is Demon's Souls. And Demon's Souls, I wanted to go back to it before going to like Dark Souls 2 and 3 and finishing Elden Ring and all those other stuff. I wanted to go back to Demon Souls because I wanted to finish that game before I got to the other more refined entries of the series instead of going back to Demon Souls after experiencing those and potentially hating it. Demon Souls is a game I can get down with, but it is very janky. It was definitely a lot more improved by Dark Souls, not helped by the fact I'm playing the remastered version of Dark Souls, which fine-tunes the controls a little bit more and the interface a little bit more. Demon Souls is definitely a lot more clunky. It is absolutely the first Souls game in many ways. And I'm playing the PS3 version, not the PS5 remake, just so that's clear. And I did not end up finishing it either. That being said, there's a lot I appreciate about Demon Souls. I think I like the fact that it's more like linear and level designed levels instead of an open world. I think that kind of suits the Souls format the best. That way you can just learn the levels and accrue a lot of knowledge of them, and once you have all of that and your equipment's in order, you can just clear through that very seamlessly and then make your way to the boss and then beat the boss, and hooray, you've made progress, and also here's a new chunk of the level, and also here's a warp point, and also you just did a good job in general. So although I do love the feeling of like Dark Souls or Bloodborne, of like seeing a random corridor and going down that corridor and then going through a really long rabbit hole until you eventually end up into a new area that you didn't even really know was there before, I think there is still merit to the level design and the level segmentation of Demon Souls that is interesting. And it still has a lot of the hallmarks of creating shortcuts within the segments of the levels to make it a little bit easier to go through. So there's still definitely that Souls spirit in there that has not reached its logical conclusion yet, but is still compelling. I do want to finish it in time, but again, it's just a matter of not having enough free time. But otherwise, yeah, I like Demon Souls quite a bit. DLC Quest is probably the most interesting and kind of out of place game on this list, mostly because I think it is most relative to the very specific era it released in. It came out at a time where DLC was still relatively new and also made a lot of jokes about DLC and its various practices, which, although definitely highlighted some of the shadier aspects of the practice at the time, in a way, I don't think we realized just how badly it would become and how a little bit less funny DLC Quest would be retroactively. Like, there's definitely a lot of jokes to be made about, like, how, oh, what if they made DLC where you have to purchase the ability to walk left or to use your jump button or whatever. And there's definitely the, like, hyper exaggerated features like that where it's like, okay, no reasonable developer would ever limit their game this much and microtransaction their game this much, but it definitely does highlight some of the practices that were happening around the time, like paying for the true ending or like not being able to progress without buying DLC and like whole map packs that really extend the game, which kind of make the game feel less satisfying without them. So it definitely highlighted the practices of the time that were bad, that we're still struggling with now. But I don't know, is the fact that a game which like removes quality of life features or like hides a lot of things that used to just be included in games inherently behind paywalls, like that's still accurate today. So in some ways it still holds up, but I think kind of the nature of the game that it is, and I know it's not like a hugely extensive game. It was just kind of one of those games, it's like, it's in my Steam library. I can kind of feel like playing a game like this. So that's why it is here. That's why I did play it, and it's not long. It's like 2 hours long, maybe. I don't know, it just kind of has the vibe of a Flash game, which is kind of interesting, but not like super compelling otherwise. So it's not one of those games I would recommend you go out and play, because I don't think this is far from one of the greatest games of all time, and it's far from like interesting commentary on DLC and its practice. It is fairly surface level in that respect, but whatever. It was fine enough. All right, now we come to a proper series of games, so we can go to back to back to back with this one, the Famicom Detective Club series. This one kind of flew under my radar not flew under my radar, I was aware of them before, but this year saw the release of Emio the Smiling Man, which was the first game in the Famicom Detective Club series in over 25 years. So that was a very novel release for Nintendo, and we'll talk more about that when we get there. But with that game releasing, I figured I was interested in the game, but I thought it's probably worth getting the other Famicom Detective Club games and playing those first, so that way I'm ready for Emio and that I have the context for it. So that's what I ended up doing. I played these games in chronological order for when they released. I mean, the two remakes came out simultaneously, but in order they released for the Famicom way back in the day. So I played The Missing Heir first, then The Girl Who Stands Behind, and then Emio the Smiling Man. And we'll go through that in that order. So I think I can kind of just talk about them together, but we'll start with Missing Heir, obviously. I think this game is kind of basic in terms of its mystery and its overall plot, and it's not exceptionally interesting. Now, for a mystery game, I do think it sets itself up effectively. You're kind of thrown into there knowing there's something going on, but having no information about it because the main character has lost his memories, amnesia, whole subplot. It works in the context of the game, I swear. So that's going on. So you have to end up resolving the mystery, and as you're doing that, murder victims are coming up in this rich family, and they're dropping one by one. So there's a lot of tension going on. There's a lot of stakes going down, and it does make for a compelling mystery, one that's set up effectively and one that continues to remain effective throughout its runtime. Like I said, it was kind of basic. I had a feeling of where the story was going as it was happening, and I was picking up on a lot of the details as they were coming up, and I was predicting what the foreshadowing was alluding to, which ended up being right almost every time. So I figured out, I guess we'll throw up the spoilers. So I figured out very early on that it turns out your protagonist of the game is the missing heir, who is meant to inherit this rich family fortune. And then I also figured out that Amachi was the antagonist who was killing off all these people to begin with. I did get slightly wrong the long-lost brother subplot. I thought he was working with Amachi. So that one I got slightly wrong, but I did kind of figure out that Amachi was behind it because just like meta implicitly, it just felt like, yeah, it makes the most sense for the culprit to be this guy. Yeah, I guess if you're into visual novels, you might find something more to enjoy here than I did. But I think that this isn't a game you need to go out seeking to play. I think this is probably, to be honest, the most skippable game of the Famicom Detective Club series. It's not a bad game. It's just basic and it's just predictable. And for a mystery game, I do think that is kind of a bigger blow against it. But The Girl Who Stands Behind, on the other hand, is a lot more interesting. I mean, I think The Missing Heir sets up itself well, effectively enough. And I think The Girl Who Stands Behind also sets itself up with about as equal of build-up and eventual payoff. And I think from the mid-game to the late game, the mystery is a lot more engaging and a lot more unpredictable with where it's going, and it does lay out a lot of effective red herrings for you, which definitely caught me off guard because I thought, oh, it has to be this because of this, and it turns out, nope, literally just there to trick you and be a red herring. So the mystery was a lot more interesting throughout. I don't think it is quite as suspenseful as The Missing Heir. Although there are a few additional victims, I don't think they're as high profile or as numerous as in The Missing Heir. That being said, I thought the overall mystery of it was a lot more interesting. And I guess we'll throw up the spoiler tag right now too. Now I think the culprit of the mystery is not all that shocking because the game gives you a lot of the information to naturally lead you to that. Because the culprits are obviously either Hibino or the principal guy who I can't remember the name of, and there is enough going against either that it could be either. But I don't think it was delivered in all that satisfying of a way, or I'm not sure how to describe it really, but when it ended up being Hibino, I'm like, yeah, that makes sense, but the exact explanation I thought was kind of unsatisfying because the principal ends up dying too. I don't remember if it was because of Hibino or someone else killed him, or did he kill himself? I don't know. The ending of The Girl Who Stands Behind, a lot happens in rapid succession, so I think it's kind of easy to lose the plot, and I feel like the mystery at its conclusion can be slightly unsatisfying, but overall, it was the better of the two Famicom Detective Club games, at least from the remake side. A thing about both of these games too, which is my biggest problem with them as visual novels, is they're surprisingly difficult to get all the information for and to get the progression flags triggered for them. Like I kind of forgot about that until just now, but in order to move on with the story, you may have to ask the same question of people multiple times, and then when you ask multiple times, you may have to go back to a previous question to ask to somehow get new information, which will then progress you in the mystery. So what I would end up doing is I would end up like leaving conversations and going to other places and investigating different things that were completely unrelated, and then going back to the same person out of frustration and just brute forcing all the options until I eventually found the progression flag. So I think these games are slightly annoying to play. I think visual novel design, as because it's weird to say, because like how much more improved could visual novels have gotten in like 30 years, considering what their gameplay format is like. But yeah, Famicom Detective Club, I think, is kind of one of the more annoying visual novels to play as far as like progression flags go. That being said, Girl Who Stands Behind, it was a lot more enjoyable than The Missing Heir was. So now we come to Emio the Smiling Man, which unfortunately I did not finish this year. I don't think I even got like remotely far into it, if I'm not mistaken. So to be honest, I have a lot of setup for the story, but no payoffs yet. So I think the story starts off in a equally as interesting, if not slightly more interesting place than The Girl Who Stands Behind. I heard that the later parts of the game definitely take more advantage of its M rating, but I mean, even in the early game, it's showing that off well, because your murder victims this time are teenagers, like middle school age teenagers. So that's pretty unsettling up front. I heard the rest of the game justifies the M rating, which I do think is kind of a interesting factoid about Emio the Smiling Man. It is the first Nintendo developed game to ever get an M rating. Now, Nintendo has certainly published M rated games before in the past, but they themselves have never made a game before that ever received that high of a maturity level rating. So I think that made it kind of novel. That made me kind of curious to see what they're doing with it. And I'm still interested to finish the game. Again, it was just a matter of competition. That's going to be a running theme for many of the unfinished games this year. Is I enjoyed them a lot. I'm interested in playing them. I just could not find the time to. But as of right now, we'll say it's slightly above The Missing Heir, because I'm interested to see where the game continues to go. Again, I just don't have the payoffs for anything it set up. Alright, so Final Fantasy VII Rebirth is one of the biggest games to have come out this year, and Unfortunately, another did not finish. And it was kind of hard for me not to just finish this game, to dedicate the time to it. Because, to be honest, I'm kind of down on the Final Fantasy VII Remake trilogy. To contextualize this, Final Fantasy VII Remake was a game I absolutely loved in 2020. That being said, I did not love the ending of that game, and I did not love what it implicated for the rest of the Remake trilogy going forward. So I guess to spoil Remake, but also to talk about what Rebirth, the conceit of Rebirth, is in general. The Final Fantasy VII Remake trilogy is not a remake of Final Fantasy VII. It is a stealth sequel to the events of Final Fantasy VII that happen to be taking place during Final Fantasy VII. It's nonsense. But it is a direction that had a lot of people interested. It had me curious at the very least, because I was interested to know what they were going to do, but it also terrified me, because I think the story of the original Final Fantasy VII is beautiful. There is a lot of theming about the environment, about preserving our planet, about personal identity, about corporate takeover, about a lot of different aspects. But the Final Fantasy VII Remake is a game about Final Fantasy VII, which was an odd choice. There was a statement about the new Star Wars trilogy when Episode 7 first came out all the way back in 2015. It was that long ago, oh my goodness. There was an opinion that was echoed during that movie's release, which I agreed with, and it resonates with me still to this very day, that Episode 7 by itself was enjoyable, but the enjoyment of it was, or for the future, was ultimately contingent on the quality of the rest of the two movies that would come out. And if you don't know how I feel about the new Star Wars trilogy, we can say confidently that I'm down on Episode 7 now, despite me also enjoying that movie way back in the day. And I'm fearing that Final Fantasy VII Remake's trilogy is heading towards a similar fate. I also said the same thing for Final Fantasy VII Remake when that game first came out, this game is incredible, but again, I might feel very differently about this game as the remake trilogy progresses, depending on how much they muck up the story. And I don't know quite what to think about yet. As far as I've made into Final Fantasy VII Rebirth, the very introduction of the game, it's definitely doing some freaky stuff that I don't think I care for that much. I think I see some mucking up of the story right there, but everything from what I've played onward was a faithful retelling of Final Fantasy VII's narrative. Granted, they've changed things, obviously, but it is still telling the same story that I fell in love with and generally liked. So I'm in a weird place right now of, am I getting a actual remake right now, or are they doing some freaky deaky stuff that I haven't seen yet? Which, based on what I've heard about the ending in particular, it sounds like they're doing some freaky deaky stuff. But again, I have not made it that far yet. So I got some weird vibes about Final Fantasy VII Rebirth, which is preventing me from allocating the time to it further, even though I am interested in what they do with it, even if the answer is going to disappoint me. That being said, I'm also kind of down on the gameplay of Final Fantasy VII Rebirth. Now, I loved 7 Remake way back in 2020. That was like one of my favorite action RPGs ever made when I played that game. And yet Rebirth, I could not get into. It felt way worse to me playing it than Final Fantasy VII Remake felt back in 2020. I felt like I was living in an alternate reality. I'm like, oh my goodness, why does this game feel so much worse? Is it just that I don't have as much free time anymore to learn the battle system again? Is it the fact that I'm relearning this battle system with 6 different characters all at once. And instead of just like Cloud first and then Barret and then Aerith and then Tifa and then whatever, and progressing linearly like that. So would I have liked this game more if I played Final Fantasy VII Remake right before Rebirth, or at least like a year before Rebirth again? But also I feel like the enemy design is just worse. I feel like attacks come out really fast and they do a lot of damage and they're hard to prepare for. So I just bumped the difficulty down to easy, which ironically I'm like, well, way back in 2020, I'm like, well, if you're not good at Final Fantasy VII Remake, then maybe you deserve to play it on easy because this game's actually expertly designed. I'm like, I'm living my own curse. Turns out I'm the impatient idiot that needs easy mode now. Oh no, life comes at you fast. But yeah, it was hard for me to kind of come to grips with. So I don't think I would say that Rebirth was strictly unenjoyable. And I guess I can there's still room for me to understand where the Game of the Year allegations are coming from. Allegations? What a weird way to say that. There's still time for me to see why people say this is the Game of the Year, despite being a stupid remake that's not actually a remake of a game from 25 years ago. More than that. It's like 28 years old now. Oh boy. So, I feel like the placements for a lot of these are like really ambiguous. I don't take anything in the bottom tier of this list too seriously. I don't even know if I feel comfortable about these rankings, but at the same time, I don't know how else to rank them because most of these aren't finished. Speaking of a game that I haven't finished, Granblue Fantasy. This game came out pretty early in the year, and it looked pretty. It looked enjoyable. I don't know, I've never been into Granblue. This is my first time engaging with the Granblue universe at all. So I thought this would probably make a very good introduction to it. I didn't make it very far. It looks pretty and that's about it. The combat, from what I've played, is very simple. You can play as different characters and they all have slightly different movesets. I don't think it's like a gacha game at all, but it does feel like the original Granblue Fantasy, I believe, was a gacha game. So there's a lot of different characters in the world and a lot of different characters you can recruit and use pretty much right away. But yeah, the story didn't do anything for me from the time I played it. Granted, I only played like 3 hours, which, if I'm not mistaken, this game for the main story is actually ridiculously short in comparison to a lot of other RPGs out there. So apparently I've made it decently far into the game, despite it only being 3 hours. But I mean, I champion RPGs that are shorter, so that definitely was kind of an appealing aspect of me for getting the game, is that, oh, it's a shorter RPG too, but it just didn't do anything for me. It was too simple. Gravity Rush is one of those Astro Bot made me want to play Sony games, Sony platformers even, if you look a little bit ahead. So I originally got Gravity Rush back in 2017. I bought myself a PlayStation Vita for some reason, and then Gravity Rush is one of the games I got along with it. And at the time, I was not very into it. I did not make it more than a couple hours into the game at the time. Didn't find it particularly enjoyable, but I picked it up again now, and I felt a little bit more comfortable with it now than I did back then. I think this is, to be honest, a fairly cumbersome game. It is a really cool concept of you can shift gravity whenever you want, and then cling on to any surface you want, and then dash around through the air. So it definitely handles that aspect of the game as well as it could. That being said, as well as it could is still very nauseating. You have to either move the camera around a lot, or you can use like the gyro of the PlayStation Vita to move around. That makes it easier in some ways, but you're either moving your system around a lot, and by extension your neck and your arms a lot too, or you're using the analog stick, which is not the most precise on the Vita. And I think just platforming and just shifting gravity, I think that is reasonable enough of a task on its own. I think where it gets complicated is when combat is introduced into the mix and enemies are moving around pretty fast, and your most reliable move for attacking that I felt was your gravity kick, which requires you to move your camera onto an enemy and then you press the square button and then you dash towards them. But that does not work for a lot of the flying and mobile enemies because they will move around past you and then your reticle won't be centered on them anymore, and then you just dash past them. So that makes aerial combat in particular really difficult and really nauseating. The game isn't exceptionally hard, it's just cumbersome. And it's also, in my opinion, kind of a gross game because it's a lot of yellows and greens, as you can probably tell by the image right here. And the lower resolution of the Vita makes the visuals kind of washed out and not very appealing to look at. I can't speak for Gravity Rush 2, but that looked a lot better from just screenshots from what I saw. Interested to play Gravity Rush 2 because this game ends in kind of a weird place where I thought there was going to be more game than there was based off of my progress in the story. Like literally, this is one of those games I would like constantly pick up and put down throughout the year. Or I guess throughout after I played Astro Bot, so a couple months. So I'd pick it up and down for a couple months at a time, or a couple weeks at a time. And then the last time I put it down for a couple weeks, I came back up, opened up the mission, and found out I was playing the final mission of the game, which I didn't, from a story pacing perspective, I didn't feel like that was the final mission at all until they just directly told me, hey, this is a point of no return. I'm like, wait, what? So the game ended way faster than I was expecting it to end, but it did all right. It was fine enough of a game. Jak and Daxter takes me back. Now, this is not a game I had played for myself until this year, but it was one of those games on PlayStation 2 that it's like, oh man, if I had a PlayStation 2, I'd want to get Jak and Daxter because that game looks cool. And it turns out to be a Banjo-Kazooie-like platforming game, maybe kind of obviously based on the name. And it is kind of a weird series, from what I understand, is because this is the only game in the series quite like this one. In my mind, I compare the Jak and Daxter series to Ty the Tasmanian Tiger, oddly enough, where the first game is this very fun and very cutesy Banjo-Kazooie-like platforming 3D collectathon type of game, and then after that one game, they pivot their series into a more action-oriented direction, chasing the Grand Theft Auto open-world mission structure kind of gameplay loop, which is, I think, fascinating that both of those series experienced the exact same trajectory. Now, that being said, I've not played Jak 2 and Jak 3, so take that with a grain of salt. But I was charmed by Jak and Daxter. I don't think it was an exceptionally amazing game, but it worked for me reasonably well enough. I think I don't have like amazingly strong opinions on it. I definitely enjoyed it more than a lot of these games below it. That being said, I don't really desire to come back to this game anytime soon. And I'm interested to play the sequels just to see what they're like, but I know they're not going to be anything like this game, so that makes it a bit odd. But I don't know, something about just the Banjo-Kazooie type of collectathon platforming loop. I know there's reason to kind of dunk on it, but it's just a satisfying gameplay loop to me. I really enjoy it a lot. So any game like that, it just hits a part of my brain that I really love. Kamiko is a very simple kind of game, just a little arcadey Zelda-like game. It's not like an open world game, it is very level based, so it's overall simple. It came out originally way back in 2017. It's just been in my Steam library for a bit, so I gave it a shot now, and yeah, it was fun. Not exceptional at all. It is just kind of the game that it is. I don't really have a lot to say about it. I don't think it really does anything particularly unique. You do get like a selection of 3 different characters that have 3 different weapons you can choose from at the beginning. From what I understand, they all experience the same story. They all go through the same levels. So I did either 2 characters or like 1.5 playthroughs. I'm not sure. I don't remember. But I played the game once, finished it, did at least a certain amount of the game as another character, and then just kind of stopped there. If there is a reward for completing the game as all 3 characters, I don't know it. Not that it would take that long to do. I just played the blue sword-wielding girl character, and that was all I did. But enjoyable game, just not very noteworthy. Okay, this year kind of saw me fall back in love with the Zelda series a little bit. Not that I was ever really down on Zelda, but like after Tears of the Kingdom, my excitement for the series and the future of it kind of waned, and also kind of made me forget kind of the older Zelda formula that I love so much in a weird way. So Echoes of Wisdom was coming out, and I wanted to feel the Zelda vibe again, and there was a really good opportunity to do so because there were 2 Zelda games which I had yet to finish. So these next batch of games is Zelda games that I was essentially playing for the first time. Now, Seasons is a game I did grow up with. My brother had it way back in the day before I was the little brother and lost the game cartridge for him, which I still feel bad about to this day. So the Seasons is a game I do have some nostalgia for. And then I bought the games again when they came to 3DS Virtual Console back in 2014 or so. And then I played through most of Seasons, but then got stuck somewhere around the 6th or 7th dungeon of the game. In the overworld, I couldn't figure out how to progress any further. And rather than look up any guides, I just kind of stopped and said, I'll finish them another time. And 10 years later, here I am starting the games from scratch again. So yeah, I decided to play through both these games at the same time and commit to them. And not at the same time, I play them one after another because I know about the linked game stuff. So Seasons was the game I played first because it was the one I have more familiarity with and more nostalgia for. So I played it, and Seasons is pretty good. Of the 2 games, it is the more action-oriented of the pair, which means more combat, more enemies. I think they're roughly comparable in terms of combat and puzzles, but definitely the focuses they advertise are accurate and as follows. That being said, the combat of Oracle of Seasons is not a very difficult game at all, and especially when you get some of the later game rings, the challenge becomes pretty non-existent at that point. So, like, even the final boss is kind of pathetic. That being said, it is an enjoyable Zelda game, and I still love it. I think the overall gimmick of changing seasons is unique still to this game still. That takes advantage of the Game Boy Color hardware of displaying different tile sets and whatnot. And it just makes you think about the overworld in a fun, creative way. And although this game is definitely derivative from the Link's Awakening experience, I think the fact of changing the seasons gives the overworld a bit of extra dimension that makes it distinct from that game. Not to mention, it has obviously unique dungeons with unique concepts. And I think for the most part, they're relatively average across the board in terms of quality for Zelda dungeons. There are still a few standouts though. For example, the 6th dungeon, where you get the Magnet Glove, is one of my favorite dungeons in the series because the Magnet Glove is one of my favorite items in the Zelda series. It is such a fun item to use. But overall, it is a lot more consistently quality throughout. It is probably my top of A tier. And as I realize now, there are not as many S tiers this year as I thought there would be. I mean, I guess technically we have 3 already, but we haven't hit our S tier stride lately. It's gonna be that's wild actually. But yeah, I really liked Seasons a lot. I'd say it's nowhere near my top like 10 Zelda. Well, I mean, I guess it's kind of near because there's like 20 Zelda games, right? So it's not in my top 10 Zelda games, but it is very enjoyable. Ages is a game I haven't really played before. I played up to the first, maybe second dungeon of Ages before, but that was years ago. I mean, like many, many, many years ago. So I didn't really particularly remember Ages all that well, so effectively I was playing it again for the first time. Of the two games, it is advertised to be the more puzzle-oriented of the Oracle games, which is, again, accurate. This game has a lot more difficult puzzles, for good and for bad. In fact, from a puzzle perspective, this is one of the most challenging games in the series, and that was refreshing as someone who I would consider to be a Zelda expert, because, frankly, a lot of the puzzles in Zelda are baby easy and anyone can solve them, so to have a game that was more focused on challenging me in that aspect was very refreshing. Overall, I'd say that the game is a lot more inconsistent in terms of quality than Seasons is, but I do think it has some notable strengths. For example, its puzzles are good. I think overall, more dungeons in this game are better than all of the dungeons in Seasons. In fact, not only is the Mermaid's Cave a standout because it actually uses the gimmick of time travel in this game, whereas none of the dungeons in Seasons use the seasons as a central mechanic of their dungeon. So the Mermaid Cave takes advantage of the time travel. Frankly, it almost felt like it should have been the final dungeon for the game with how integrated it was with its theme. But that's besides the point. Even like less popular dungeons like Jabu Jabu's Belly, I thought was one of the best dungeons in the game. And I think as long as we're talking about strengths of the Oracle's games, I would say that Ages also had the better story between the two. Seasons, it feels like the story was kind of forgettable, and it didn't feel like there was that many stakes going on, but Ages was a lot more involved in terms of its plot. Vernon was a present villain who kept doing things and was being an active force in the story, where Onyx just kind of did his thing in the beginning and kind of just left you alone, which felt kind of odd and kind of unmotivating, to be honest. And especially in a linked game where no matter which of these games you play second, if you pass your code on to the second game, it'll give you a little bit more bonus scenes with like Princess Zelda, and she'll be a little bit more involved in the plot of the second game. So that also kind of enhanced my feeling of Ages having the better story. But overall, it does have some weaknesses. First off being the music is way worse than in Seasons. Like Seasons, the Game Boy Color sound chip, it's just, you gotta accept it for what it is. It's an 8-bit like processing thing. If you knew how to take advantage of it, some songs sound pleasant. I think for the most part, Seasons had some very pleasant music, like the Tarm Ruins theme lives rent-free in my brain, and it's just, that song like basically changed my brain chemistry when I listened to it for the first time. Most of the songs in Ages are unbearable. They are grating and made me want to mute my system. So that was worse. The boss fights are worse because they are also more focused on like a puzzly aspect. They are not as far challenging as far as like combat goes, but they have a specific gimmick to them that you need to figure out. Like the one where you are placing blocks down and moving blocks so that you can move like sparks to collide together to form the boss again to attack it. That was a fun boss. That was interesting, but kind of hard to set up, but it was admirable what they were going for. In fact, Echoes of Wisdom, oddly enough, reuses that boss for one of its mini-bosses, but we'll get to that later. But then there are other bosses, like, I think this is the final dungeon boss of the game. There is a specific set of tools that you need to use against it in a certain order, and to be fair, it is foreshadowed. Right before you enter the boss, you need to use those 4 specific tools in that order in order to open the door to reach him. That being said, there is nothing to correlate between that level design and the boss right there, that those are the 4 tools you need to use. So although it is like foreshadowed, it is not obvious that that's what you have to do. And I think it might be kind of difficult for a player to think about it in that way. But overall, yeah, Ages was also a fun game as well. I would say between the two, maybe it is nostalgia, but I still prefer Seasons slightly to Ages. But that's just me. I think they're both on the same level. Not the best Zelda games, certainly, but, I mean, not the best Zelda games being an A tier just makes sense, right? Anyway, we've come to the newest game in the Zelda series. At this time, The Legend of Zelda Echoes of Wisdom, the very first true Zelda game where you get to play as Zelda. So I was a bit worried about this game coming into it because I liked Breath of the Wild. I did not like everything that it did, but I at least appreciated what it was going for. And I hoped that the next game after that would at least try to incorporate some of the more classic Zelda staples into it again. And then Tears of the Kingdom came along and did not do any of that and only doubled down on Breath of the Wild's design philosophies. And I talked about Tears of the Kingdom last year. Tears of the Kingdom is my least favorite Zelda game of all time. And yes, I am aware of what I'm saying when I say that. So I was kind of down on Echoes of Wisdom because it looked like it was going to do a lot of the same open-air design philosophy that Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom were doing, and it looked like that would be applied to this new game as well, that even the 2D Zelda games would not be safe from this boring format, if I'm being honest. So it made me worried coming in. That being said, I still gave it a shot anyway, and it quickly won me over. It was an effective compromise between the two styles of Zelda that we've come to know and love. Now, if you saw my other Game of the Year video, the more structured one instead of this one, which should be going up before this one, but although it is not yet completed, I talk about this aspect of compromise and how, yeah, it's the step in the direction I want this series to go in. Now, I still have problems with this open air format, and I don't think those will ever go away because they are inherently tied to the format of the game. So I don't think that can ever truly go away, and nor would I ask it to. But as long as they keep introducing more of these fundamental Zelda concepts, as long as they have the proper dungeons, as long as they have more of a limited range of options you could use, as long as they have side quests with actually interesting rewards behind doing them, as long as they have caves where I don't know what the chest at the very back of them is going to have by the time I go into them, as long as they have like truly optional dungeons that feel like they have substantial content behind them and not just a shrine that takes 5 minutes to do. That's the direction I want to see the Zelda series go in. So I hope they do take a lot of lessons from this game and learn from it. In general, though, it is still fairly flawed as an experience. The combat in particular, again, it's tied to the fundamental design of what the game is, so you really can't change it without radically changing the whole game. That being said, having enemies doing the fighting for you instead of fighting yourself just doesn't feel very interesting. And the fact that you only have one slot to assign an echo to instead of multiple item slots like in most other Zelda games, it means you have to menu a lot more and pause the game a lot more for this game than other Zelda games in the series. Which, granted, is kind of a recurring problem amongst Zelda in general, but it doesn't feel nearly as pronounced when in these newer games you have to go into the menu all the time and pause the menu or pause the action all the time. So there's definitely at least multiple hotkeys and item slots would have made this a lot more of a manageable game to play. And also, there's just so many echoes that I started just phasing out a lot of the less interesting ones in favor of the safest and most boring solutions. So in the end, it was an interesting game. I'm glad I played it. I'm glad they tried something like this. It is among my lower tiers for the Zelda series, but regardless, that was it. The newest Zelda game was completed. The Oracle games have been completed. Now I have finally played through every single game in the Zelda series. I can lay that to bed and have nothing else more to add to that. Although, then I began to think about it, and I realized, technically, I didn't finish all of Majora's Mask by myself. So that then became my new priority for this last year. So Majora's Mask is an interesting game in a lot of ways. To establish context for this one, Majora's Mask used to be my least favorite 3D Zelda game. Yes, even lower than Skyward Sword. Maybe there was like some unresolved childhood like fear of the moon, and I remember very vividly when I was a child watching the cutscene when the moon was crashing down on the final day into the clock tower, and then I just shut the console off because I was so scared. So, Majora's Mask has always been the scariest Zelda game to me because of maybe a lot of that unresolved fear. I don't think it's nearly that scary anymore, obviously. So maybe that did a lot of emotional damage to me that I never really reconciled with for a bit. But also, I think because it was such a beloved Zelda game, I have a weird thing where it's just like, if something's popular, I want to be different and not like that thing so that I'm unique. But that's ridiculous. So I put that to bed. But a couple of years ago, something happened to me, which I like to call the Great Opinion Shift, where the way I looked at video games suddenly became a lot different than it was ever before. I would say until a couple years ago, I was a lot more traditionally critical of video games, I would say. I liked good games, I did not like bad games, and I wanted to plainly and objectively explain why I thought games were good or bad. As the years pass on and I realize that a lot of my favorite games of all time are actually, to some extent, reasonably flawed, it made me realize that I guess I don't really care about good or bad games. I just want to play interesting games. And I think Majora's Mask, upon further inspection, is one of the most interesting Zelda games. It does a lot of things that no other Zelda game would ever attempt ever again. Particularly and most notably, its 3-day calendar system. It takes place in a world that is not Hyrule, despite using a lot of familiar characters. It has a very intricate side quest system. It has really challenging dungeons comparatively to the other games in the series. It has transformations for Link to take on different abilities and forms on the fly. It is a fascinating game. It is an interesting game. So as of a couple years ago, and especially after Tears of the Kingdom 2, which turned out to be probably the safest sequel that could have been made for Breath of the Wild, I then began to retroactively appreciate what Majora's Mask did in doing something radically different when they could have just made another Ocarina of Time. Now granted, the development context for Majora's Mask is interesting because they only had a year to develop this game, which, in case you don't know game development, like timing and whatnot, a year to develop any game, well, maybe not any game, but a year to develop a game at the scale a Zelda game is, especially back in the 90s, when technology was not as robust as it is now, that is a huge undertaking. And they definitely had to compromise in a lot of ways, but a lot of those compromises lent themselves to a lot of this interesting design and the stuff that made Majora's Mask unique. Like, oh, we don't have time to make a very expansive world with all these different towns and cities. What if we made like a time cycle where everyone it follows a strict scripted pattern instead of having to program AI for all of them to do all these different things at day and night and whatever? Which, I don't know, that sounds more difficult to me in a way. But what do I know? I'm not a developer. I'm not a coder. I dropped out of that life. So they did that because it would be easier for them. At least they thought so at the time. They reduced the number of dungeons, but they made those dungeons more involved. They don't have a lot of main story content, but they made a lot of side content to make up for that. So a lot of interesting things came around because of Majora's Mask's circumstances. And before I keep getting too off topic here, a lot of the stuff made me interested in Majora's Mask again, and after watching some other people play through it too for the first time on like YouTube Let's Plays and stuff like that, it convinced me I had to reevaluate this game. And what really did it for me is towards the end of the year, or at least the end of the summer, I think, I found a lone CRT outside of someone's house, which they were throwing out, and I'm like, ooh, a CRT I can use for retro video games to make them feel right again. So the first game that came to my mind for some reason for the CRT was Majora's Mask, and I wanted to play the game on that CRT and experience it the way video games were meant to be, on a cool fall afternoon in my bedroom as my dad's watching football on the TV in the living room. So I hit a vibe, and I fell in love with Majora's Mask. This is my YouTuber thumbnail moment right now. I was wrong about Majora's Mask. Majora's Mask, this might be the recency bias getting to me right now, but I think Majora's Mask might be my favorite 3D Zelda game from a design perspective. For example, the dungeons are incredible. Like, Woodfall Temple is pretty basic, but for a first like Zelda dungeon, I'd say it's like slightly more involved than some of the other ones. But yeah, not too noteworthy. When people say it's the weakest dungeon in the game, it's for a reason. So Woodfall Temple is fine. Snowhead Temple definitely elevates things a lot more. It is a lot more tricky, and you need to be a lot more spatially aware of it. Great Bay Temple, I thought I was gonna hate. It is why back in the day, I had my brother do the dungeon for me because, water dungeon, no thank you. So I had him do the whole thing for me. So Great Bay and Stone Tower, I effectively played those dungeons for the first time this year. And I can definitely see where people might get confused and lost in Great Bay, but I had a blast with it. It was a very fun dungeon that utilized the effect of changing the water direction very well. And Stone Tower Temple is incredible. People are right when they say it's one of the best Zelda dungeons of all time. It is fantastically themed. It has great music. It takes advantage of all the forms and all the abilities Link has learned throughout the journey. It's wonderful. And what I love about the dungeons is, and the whole game is designed like this too, is for the 3D cycle, although it seems really daunting, you don't need to worry about it so much, because not only do you have infinite retries from starting the cycle from the beginning, there are a lot of well-placed but invisible shortcuts that you might not realize are there, but once you make a little bit of permanent progress, you can use those shortcuts. Like, even in the dungeons, for example, if you're able to make it to the dungeon item opens up so many possibilities of navigating the dungeon, even from a fresh cycle, that makes it a lot easier to go through and a lot easier to catch up on your progress. So even if you made your way into the dungeon midway through your cycle and you needed to leave, but you got the dungeon item, you can pick up mostly right from where you left off. You will have to do a little bit of backtracking, so it is preferable to do a dungeon all in one cycle, but that is an option that's available to you. And for that little extra incentive, the dungeons also have the Great Fairy Pieces, which incentivize you to complete it all in one go, and are also very, very well hidden throughout the dungeon, so it makes you want to explore every inch of it and think about every room to its fullest extent. And also, that helps is that the Great Fairy rewards are legitimately useful. Like the spin attack's whatever, but the fairies are very easy to get, so you might as well get it. Double a magic bar? Heck yeah, baby. Double defense? Heck yeah, baby. The strongest sword in the game? Heck yeah, baby. Like, those are so good and such great incentives. Like, Zelda, that's one of those things where it's like, how did Zelda not think to bring this concept back before? Because it's such a good idea. How have they not explored it again? Like, that's such a great way to boost challenge for expert players who want to be rewarded, but also to incentivize novice players to be a little bit more thoughtful with their dungeon progression. And also just the side stuff and how well that's paced throughout the world and how it all connects together. Like, there's so much side stuff to do. Like, despite this not being an open world game, it feels like there's so much to explore. Like, I can't help but compare this to, like, Ocarina of Time and Twilight Princess in particular, where it felt like the optional content in those games was kind of lacking. This just has a lot. There's mini games, there's optional dungeons, there's like the spider houses, there's all the side quests, obviously. So there's a lot to do for both, like just people who want to crit path the main story. You can, but Majora's Mask just isn't the same unless you're like at least trying to get 80% or 90% of it completionist. But yeah, it's a phenomenal game. It is. I don't know if I said this before, because we have the game of the year that did not come out this year, and the game of the year that I played again for this year. Which maybe that's kind of debatable because Majora's Mask is a game I've only like half played before. But I mean, I've experienced most of the content. It's just the last 2 dungeons, which I've never really done before. And I think for the fact that I turned around on this game so much is the notable part of that sentiment. Oh boy, speaking of game series I'm down on. So, this game... what to do with this one? So, this is another one of my didn't finish ones, and if I'm not mistaken, games I didn't even get that far into, relatively speaking. It's one of those cases where I just knew it wasn't worth it. I knew I wasn't going to finish it, so I just dropped it when I had the opportunity, basically. So Like a Dragon. Oddly enough, ever since it rebranded to Like a Dragon is kind of when I started falling off of it. Yakuza 0 is my first game in the series. I loved it. I went on to play Yakuza 1 through 6, and then some of its spin-offs, and then Kiwami, not Kiwami, Yakuza Like a Dragon, I really liked a lot, and was one of my favorite games in the series. But something about it, just after that, didn't hit the same for me anymore. I skipped out on Like a Dragon Gaiden, just did not have any interest in it. And even Infinite Wealth 2, I skipped out on for a bit, but then came around to. Kind of wish I just passed on the game altogether. It just did not hit the same for me. So I think the gameplay itself was fine. I think the mini-games are reasonably fun from the ones I've played. So it's not like, as far as content, gameplay, battle system, it did anything particularly wrong to strike me out as bad. Most of that comes down to the story, which I did not like. So the overall beginning of the mystery, reasonably interesting. Okay, Ichiban's mother is alive, and she just went missing in Hawaii. So let's go over there and find her. And then going to find her leads to a giant conspiracy. Okay, that makes sense. I can get down for that. Kiryu's there as well. Hey, how about that? Oh, I forgot to mention the very beginning is Ichiban proposing to Saiko, and it goes horribly wrong because of course it does. It was the least thought through proposal of all time, and they all act like middle schoolers about it. It's wild. I could not believe it. The intro chapter to this game was so bad. It was nightmarishly bad. I could not believe it. Oh my goodness. But anyway, then you get into the actual mystery, and it's like, okay, the actual mystery is more interesting, and then, hey, turns out there's a bigger conspiracy behind that, and hey, Kiryu's there. And then, I mean, the story, even in Hawaii, is very, I don't know what we're doing here. Not like mechanically what we're doing here, but like from a conceptual level, I guess. It's like what's the story going on here? You're feeling very scatterbrained, and then you learn very quickly what I will potentially talk about as a topic in my bigger Game of the Year video, or structured Game of the Year video. you learn that Kiryu has cancer, actually, and that was a very touching and powerful moment for me. And then they justify it, narratively justify it, because he was in a nuclear waste facility and got cancer, and it was wild, and I hated that. And then when I went on to play more of the story, I had to do fetch quests and like meander around Hawaii for a bit, and that was weird and stupid. And then I got past that chapter and then started running around Hawaii. And what made me stop Like a Dragon is there was that particular session, I just wanted to focus on the story. I was getting lost in too much of the side content, and I felt like I was kind of losing focus of the plot. So I wanted to get back into the plot and just focus on only main story missions. And as I'm doing that, I'm getting pulled back into the side quests, either because they're along the way to the main objective, or the main objective itself is like introducing me to side stories in the main objective. And it's like, this is not what I want to do. I just want to focus on the main story, and you're pulling me away to all these different directions. And it's like, I know that the Like a Dragon series has become known for its side quests. I know that's like a huge appeal of these games. But it's like, what if, when I played Yakuza's 1 through 6, I could just focus on those stories. I didn't get roped into that many side stuff, and if it was just a very brief introduction to them, and then that was it. But it's like, no, we're gonna introduce you to the Sugidex, and we're gonna introduce you to Sugimon battles, and you better learn how to do Sugimon battles. And it's like, I don't want to do this. I just want to know what's going on with Ichiban's mother. Can I do that? No, I can't. I'm getting roped into a crazy taxi clone now. What is going on? So that's what made me stop Like a Dragon. That's what made me lose interest very, very quickly. And from what I hear, it's just kind of okay. I'll put it above Granblue because at least I played more of it, relatively speaking, than Granblue, and it has fun side missions, it has fun mini games. So it has that at least going for it. But the main story, it's like, it does some cool stuff, and then it just does some bullshit. It's like, oh my. And from what I hear, the rest of the game story is at best just okay, and if it's anything like what I've already experienced, I don't think I'm gonna like it at all, so I just passed on it. Will I ever come back to it? I don't know. I'm curious to know what happens with Kiryu's cancer. I mean, I assume he probably dies at the end of the game, but I don't know that for certain. That much I'm interested in, at least. I want to know what happens to Kiryu, but oh, the rest of the game, I cannot. I'm sorry. Let's move on to LoveChoice. LoveChoice is just a very simple visual novel kind of game. It only takes a couple hours to get through, and I just got it on sale because it looked cute, and I needed something to do while I was waiting for another one of these games on the list to unlock for its midnight release. So I just bought it because it was on sale, and it is a game that reminds me how painfully single I am, unfortunately. But it's fun. It's adorable. It's got a very hand-drawn, like, animated kind of art style to it. Not really animated. It's a lot of still images, but it's, like, hand-drawn for the most part. It tells some very simple stories about love. What I appreciate is it tells stories about how, like, not obvious love is all the time. Like, sometimes the most logical decision you think you can make in the form of compromising for your partner is not what they need in the moment right there. And making what seems like the best choice is not actually the best choice. So that was kind of interesting. And sometimes there's more to your partner than just what seems on the surface. So there's some neat stuff there. Otherwise it's fine. Like, you're getting exactly what you think you're getting when you pick it up. Lufia in the Fortress of Doom is a very cozy RPG. This is one of the coziest RPGs I've played in a while. Super Nintendo game, very Dragon Quest inspired in its mechanics and structure and role design. It definitely has a more involved plot going on than most Dragon Quest games. I wouldn't say it's nearly to the level of Final Fantasy. But it's charming. What I like about it so much is it's a reminder of sometimes maybe this is all a JRPG needs. Maybe it just needs the basics and that's enough, and it feels good when it's that way. Now that being said, it is a very mid-tier RPG. In fact, it doesn't do anything notable with its game structure and game balance and whatnot. It is also, I wouldn't say a particularly grindy game, but I did a lot of incidental grinding in it because the encounter rate of it was abysmally high. Now the game makes up for its high encounter rate because battles are fast. Battles take like less than 20 seconds if you know what you're doing. Aside from boss battles, that is. And I also think that the core cast of party members is oddly insufferable for a Super Nintendo game. Like, I'm not convinced that any of these guys are friends. Like, even the main protagonist and Lufia, who are very romantic interest coded characters, I'm not really convinced. I'm kind of convinced that the protagonist loves Lufia. I'm not really convinced Lufia loves the protagonist. It's wild. And also Guy and Jaren's relationship is so perplexing. It's like, do you actually legitimately hate each other? I don't know what's going on. It's so funny. Less funny though is the entire last third of this game and how it's a ginormous fetch quest. And once you're fetching that quest, you have fetch quests within that fetch quest. And then after you're done with the fetch quest, you get another fetch quest. It is Fetch Quest City, and it is so like a video game plot. It is a nightmare. So, I hear Lufia 2 is way better, but I wanted to play Lufia 1 first because I didn't want to go back to Lufia 1 and get pissed off by it. Ironically, I was a little bit pissed off by it already, but it's a charming game. It worked. It did exactly what it needed to for me. Just what an RPG needed to be. And that's, you know what, that was fine. That's all I needed it to be. Okay, so now we come to some Mario and Luigi games. In fact, some Mario RPGs in general. So, this was before Brothership was announced earlier this year, but I just kind of felt like playing Partners in Time again. I haven't played this game since it originally came out on the DS, so it's been that long, and I just had an itch for it. I just wanted to feel good about it again. So Partners in Time is interesting because for a while I've heard people be very down on this game. At the very least, I know it's generally considered to be the weakest of at least the first 3 Mario and Luigi games. A few even said, from what I heard, that it's just a terrible game, actually. So I wanted to play again and figure that out for myself. Do I think so? As it turns out, no. This is actually my favorite of the Mario and Luigi games. That's what I thought back in the day as an 8-year-old or whenever these games came out for the first time. That's what I thought back then. Playing it again, reevaluating. Granted, it's been a while since I played Superstar Saga, so maybe that also needs reevaluation. But no, I'd still say that Partners in Time is my favorite of that initial trilogy. First of all, its battle system, I think, is the most fun the Mario & Luigi series has been. It does have some issues that I take with it. For example, let's come back to that. First of all, like basic attacking, you can do what you do in Superstar Saga and just press like Mario & Luigi's A or B button when you collide with an enemy to like just damage it with a timed attack more than you would have if you missed. So that's still there. But also there's a little bit of an extra dimension where if you're carrying the babies with you, if you press X before you collide with the enemy, they'll attack first, and then you can follow up with Mario's A attack later, so it adds a little bit of extra dimension to that aspect. And also, the Bros attacks in general were massively improved from Sticker Star. Instead of just being like some regular basic like super moves, now they involve some kind of item, and an interaction with that item, and the way to maximize damage with them is to attack with the babies, and then the adults, and then maybe the babies, or the adults, and the adults and the babies again. So 4 different items, you're moving your hand all across all 4 face buttons basically at the same time for different situations and with a bit of randomness. So it makes battling very chaotic and fun, and I think is the pinnacle of the Mario and Luigi combat for how much engaging and how much like mental gymnastics you need to do to ultimately maximize your damage. And this game is actually kind of difficult too, like not like intensely challenging, but like if you're keeping yourself at a low level, game pushes back at you, and it's refreshing. Not like, I don't think I ever really gamed over a ton, but it pushed back on you, and that I found that refreshing and fun. Now, what I definitely don't like about the Bros attacks system is that instead of having a Bros points stat, you instead just collect items and then use those items instead, which initially is fine, and it makes finding new Bros attacks kind of exciting because they can just pop out of a random question block and be like, oh, cannonballers, what is that? And then you experiment with it and learn, and it's like, oh, this is fun. And then you might find new ones relatively quickly. That being said, though, you eventually find so many items, and then you get so many coins which you can spend to get more items that it's like, okay, now you're never running out of copy flowers, and you've just won the rest of the game as long as you... granted, there's still at least some skill in using them well, but I mean, like, you got copy flowers. It's done. It's Jover, dude. So definitely, there is a bit of balancing problems when it comes to using the Bros items. So that I definitely prefer to having the original Bro point systems come back in later games in the series. That being said, I liked the battle system. I still think it holds up the best of the games. And I also forgot just how breezy this game is. Like, I mean, like, when I was a young child and stupid and really bad at the game, it took me like 40 hours to get through the whole thing, according to my original save file play time. But this time, I did it in just a little less than 20 hours. This game moves by very fast. I was kind of shocked, like, no way am I going to like Yoshi's Island this early, right? I thought this happened way later in the game, but no, it happens that fast. This game's breezy. And I think another point of contention for this game is that it's not structured the same way as a lot of the other Mario and Luigi games are. This game's a lot more segmented, where Princess Peach's Castle is your hub area for the game, and then there's a whole bunch of different portals that open up, and you can maybe preview those areas, but you can't really effectively progress in any of them until you're fully finished with whatever the story progression locks you to at the moment. So, I don't know, I think that's kind of neat. I can kind of see why other people don't like it and maybe prefer just the more linearly progressing structure of the previous games and the future games after that. But I don't know, they changed it up a little bit. I appreciated how they changed it up. That's just on me, though. That's my take. Well, my also take is I think this has the best story of the original trilogy, because it's just a weird oddball story that Mario games don't usually go for. Like, this is about an alien invasion, and the antagonists are just a species looking for a new place to live, and the final battle has the most, like, raw and intense, like, final battle music theme of, like, any Mario game has ever had. It's ridiculous. But yeah, you know what? I stand by this, and no matter what other people say, Partners in Time is my favorite of the original trilogy, which leads us to Bowser's Inside Story, what is, from my point of view, usually considered the best of the 3 games. That being said, it was always my least favorite growing up as a child, so that's, what an interesting dichotomy there. So if most people rank them like best being 3, 1, 2, apparently I'm rating them 2, 1, 3. Whatever. Now, Bowser's Inside Story is fine. I enjoy it, but I don't know. Something about it just doesn't quite vibe with me the same way as the other ones do. It's just more of the same, so nothing to complain about. It does really well. I feel like its pacing just isn't as strong as Partners in Time, though. I don't think it breezes quite as smoothly. It is a little bit longer than Partners in Time, but it's a negligible difference. It's a matter of a few hours longer. And I think, Mario and Luigi, they don't have the babies anymore, so it reverts back to a little bit closer to Sticker Star, although they definitely make some improvements on you still being able to do multiple attacks. It's just a little less... Actually, you know what I will say is Bowser's Inside Story, the timing for making perfect attacks is actually really strict. Like, it is shockingly strict, but it's rewarding, so I forgive it. And there's also a whole aspect of using different badges for the different attack ratings you get to do different spells, and those spells get stronger or the more, like, excellence you do or whatever. So that part is interesting, and I like just Mario and Luigi's combat. Bowser's combat, I think, is pretty dull, if I'm being honest. I think what RPGs that only have one controllable party member, what they really struggle with is the action economy, so it feels like you're waiting longer to do an action and to play the game again. Although that being said, I do like not only the giant Bowser battles, but also the Bowser's minions attacks. Those make use of the touchscreen in great ways, so I really appreciate those. But yeah, this newest playthrough of mine didn't really convince me anymore. It's still my least favorite of the initial trilogy, at least. I've not gone back to play Dream Team, and I skipped on Paper Jam entirely, so I don't know. I'm sure it's better than those two games, from what I remember at least. That being said, didn't vibe with me. I'm sorry. That's rail me in the comments if you want. But as it turns out, we got a new Mario & Luigi game this year, Mario & Luigi Brothership. Now, I really like Brothership, despite not having finished it, for disclosure. That being said, I understand why people don't like this game. I understand. Although from memory alone, Brothership is a lot faster and gets you into the action faster and lets you just play the video games sooner than Dream Team does. And it's not nearly as wordy as Dream Team, and the pacing is a lot more. I actually say Brothership's pacing is actually really good, despite how long the game is and how segmented the game is. In fact, I'd say the segmentation of going to an island and doing everything on that island and moving on to new islands, I'd say that is why the pacing works so well for me. That being said, like, getting new attacks takes a really long time. It takes you a long time just to get your hammers, and then it takes a long time to get your first Bros special attacks, which are your red and green shells. And then it takes a ridiculously long amount of time for you to get another Bros attack. Like, you need to play through at least like 25% of the game before you get your second Bros attack. It is nuts how poorly that aspect of the game is paced. So there is definitely an issue of this game's not giving you enough fun tools to play with as soon as it can. And I'm sure it took a lot of work to wire up those animations. I'm not saying it didn't, but this game could have benefited from more tools sooner. But I don't know. It's Mario & Luigi. It has a very easily fun gameplay loop to get into. In fact, rail me for this in the comments if you want to, but I actually enjoy this game more than Bowser's Inside Story. You can take for that whatever you will. I won't pretend to know what I'm thinking here. This is such an odd list. Like, all of this makes sense. This makes sense. I feel like we're pushing it, and I don't know what's going on here. That's my check-in right now. You know what? These videos aren't about the tier list anyway. It's just about me yapping. I'm just yapping about the games I played. But let's finish out the Mario RPGs. So Paper Mario: The Thousand Year Door. I'm specifically talking about the remake here. Paper Mario: The Thousand Year Door is one of my favorite games of all time, I would say. But I played the remake, did not get very far in the remake, and I only stopped playing the remake because I was confident they weren't going to screw it up that much. And from what I played, they did just fine. So yeah, I would say they did fine. They did everything they needed to. The only huge disappointment for me in terms of the remake is that they did not, or that the game's only in 30 frames per second as opposed to 60 FPS. Although I don't feel that substantial of a drawback for that, it is still a downgrade as opposed to the original GameCube version that makes the game feel just that little bit less smoother. Although when playing the game, I don't think it's that noticeable if you just vibe out to it. But I do like that they make the fast travel system a little bit easier. I hear that really improves the General White section way later in the game, which, although I like that section because I think it's funny, apparently a lot of people don't think it's funny, so I understand why they changed that. I also really like that each chapter has its own unique battle theme now. That's really cool. The graphics are a lot spruced up, and going back to the original GameCube version, the game looks a lot more flat now than it used to. No pun intended there. So yeah, it does good as a remake. It's still one of my favorite games of all time. It's just what it is. It's Paper Mario: The Thousand Year Door again, and I'm glad that it's back. And hopefully, because I know the game didn't sell exceedingly well, but it did all right. I hope the success was enough for Intelligent Systems to look at and be like, maybe people want Paper Mario games to be more like this. I just want them to compromise. Make Paper Mario the Echoes of Wisdom. That's all I want you to do. Anyway, The Elder Scrolls 3 Morrowind, well, if this was truly in alphabetical order, this should have been with the E's and not with the M's. Oh well. Morrowind, I did not finish. I did not get very far in, probably remotely speaking, but it's one of those games where, I just felt like playing some old-ass computer RPGs this year, and Morrowind was the one I decided to focus on, and I just kind of fell in love with it. Now, I think Morrowind is a very difficult game to get into if you're not at least willing to read the instruction manual and play around with its systems and figure them out. There's a lot of resistance that is no longer in the series and is no longer in games, contemporary games nowadays. So I think this is a very difficult game to go back to. Case in point, there's no waypoints for your quests anymore. You have to read directions and look at road signs and pay attention and look at your map and figure out where you actually are in the world. But this is just one of those games where I've always felt this about Morrowind, and I feel about this way even more now. It just kind of feels good to explore the world, if nothing else. I think it just feels like a comfy world to be in, which I don't know. I mean, I think the world of Morrowind is kind of gross from a natural perspective. Ew, nature, gross. Swamps, gross. But it's just what it is. I don't know. But I am interested to keep playing this game. It just kind of fell to the wayside, and I love it. I don't know what to tell you, Matt. I love Morrowind now. It just feels good. It just feels good. I don't know. Pepper Grinder is a game that also feels good. The whole conceit of this game is, what if we took that one mechanic from Ori the Will of the Wisps and made a whole game around it? And yeah, that's exactly what they did. They made a mechanic around, or they made a game around the digging mechanic, and it feels good. It definitely makes it a unique kind of platformer because it's so built around that one idea. It's not an exceptionally long or an exceptionally difficult game. In fact, if I have a criticism for it, I feel like it could have used 1 or 2 more worlds or 3 or 4 more levels to really explore it. Because I think what they do with the mechanic is interesting, but I think they could have pushed themselves a little bit further. Now, I don't hold any developer against pushing themselves a little bit further because my imagination sucks. I don't want to take away from any imagination the developers may have been struggling with at the time, but I just felt like there was a little bit of game missing. I felt like if there was a little bit more. That being said, it was fun. It was a nice little play it all in one afternoon game. It did well. It did well. All right, now we come to Persona 3 Reload. Now, Persona 3 is one of my favorite games of all time. I don't think I need to hide that. I've made a couple videos about Persona 3, just preaching my love for it. So a remake of it in the style of Persona 5 is something that I wanted to see in the past, but kind of over time grew more resistant to the idea, because as I played Persona 3 more, what I really appreciated about it was the kind of more obtuse, more resistive gameplay features of it that are not generally liked by the wider audience, but I think make it an interesting game to play. For example, the AI-controlled party members. Sure, it's unpopular, and I get why it's unpopular, because we don't want to put control in the hands of the AI now, do we? But the game is designed for it, and it really makes you feel like a leader when you're giving your teammates commands instead of just telling them to do one specific thing. So I appreciated that aspect of Persona 3 over time. I appreciated the social simulator side of the side of the game over time, because you really need to keep up with everyone's schedules and see people regularly, because if you don't, they will get mad at you and you'll reverse your social link and you'll need to take time to patch up your relationship with them. So there's a lot of those little aspects which were so obviously going to get nuked into a remake, because God forbid we have a challenging game that makes us think, right? So I was kind of worried about Persona 3 Reload. Not to mention that I played a remake recently where it remade the game but turned out to be a stealth sequel of their most famous RPG in that company's history. I guess Persona 3 is not the most famous in Alice's history, but it was arguably the most important game they made for a long time. So I was worried that they were gonna muck up this game. They did just fine. Now, Persona 3 Reload, I would still say, is the version of Persona 3 best suited for people who don't like Persona 3. But overall, it did exactly what it needed to. Did it do everything it should have? In my opinion, it did not. But it is the most accessible version of Persona 3. It is the most developed version of Persona 3's narrative. It's the prettiest version of Persona 3. Its soundtrack is fine. I would say that, in my opinion at least, overall the soundtrack, its returning songs are weaker than the original mixes of them. That being said, all of the new songs, banger. Like Full Moon, Full Life, banger. Disturbing the Peace, banger. Color Your Night, certified banger, dude. Holy crap. And also, just Reload combines various aspects of all different versions of Persona 3, and people will complain that there's no definitive version of Persona 3, and I guess technically still not, but I mean, unless you count the FemC mod that the community is developing, and you want to include that into the game too, overall, yes, this is the definitive version of Persona 3 now. And in many ways, I still prefer the original PS2 version. That being said, Persona 3 Reload is enough of an upgrade, but also not enough to outright replace it. So in my opinion, that is way more of a compliment to the original's legacy than something like Final Fantasy VII Rebirth. I don't want my video game remakes to reimagine the game. Just upgrade them. Just do what they are, but more. Just do what they are, but prettier. If a game's getting remade, one way or another, it's replacing the original anyway. So you might as well just do what you can to invalidate it, I guess. Now, that being said, I'm a weirdo who's gonna love the original versions of the games anyway. Oh well, you know what? Persona 3 did good. It did good. And then Metaphor came along and just blew it out of the water. Metaphor is so good, dude. So, while Persona 3 Reload was taken over by P Studio, it is worth noting that P Studio is not the same as it was even 5 years ago. Most of the key figures of P Studio who made Personas 3, 4, and 5 branched off and formed Studio Zero at Atlus, and Metaphor is the fruits of their labor. For those who were paying attention to this game way back in the day, this was originally announced as Project Fantasy or Project ReFantazio or something like that, and it evolved. It was under the radar for a long time. Many assumed it might have been canceled without us knowing, but then it came back in a big way this year as Metaphor ReFantazio. And initially, I was kind of, I wouldn't say cautious about Metaphor. I was excited for it, but I did not expect this game to match my love for Personas 3, 4, and 5, which are 3 of my favorite video games ever made. But it impressed me. Now, there's definitely some things that I could have done without in Metaphor. Metaphor probably would have been my game of the year over Astro Bot this year if it wasn't for those few aspects. For example, if this game just wasn't a 100-hour-long RPG, it might have had a better chance against Astro Bot. If it was if it was 60 hours long for a completionist playthrough, I might have put it over Astro Bot. If its dungeons were at least interesting, I probably would have put it over Astro Bot. Because, oh my goodness, like, I do not like Persona 5's dungeons, and yet I feel like I have to apologize for Persona 5 now, because I did not realize how bad it could have gotten. Like, Metaphor, the first couple of dungeons of Metaphor, they work, they're fine, they fulfill their function, okay, I can get behind it, but apparently the game blew its load on the first couple dungeons, I guess. So, every dungeon after that is so unremarkable and so bad. And don't get me started on the optional dungeons. Like, tell me the difference between any of those forest areas. Tell me the difference between any of those cave areas. I mean, at least Mount Volcano was at least somewhat interesting. At least that had something going for it, but the rest of it didn't. But obviously, I still loved Metaphor if I'm placing it this high. But to be honest, I think it's this high because I am familiar with the back catalog of Atlus and the games they make, because in many ways, Metaphor is the ultimate Atlus game. Because this game isn't just basically Persona 6, it's basically also Shin Megami Tensei 5. It's basically also Digital Devil Summoner 3. It's also basically Raito 3. It's also basically Etrian Odyssey 6. It combines everything that this company has been known for in the past and mashes them all together. And it creates, like I just said, the ultimate Atlus game. So if you're familiar with Atlus and their catalog of games, I think this game is a lot easier to appreciate what it does well, as opposed to someone who maybe heard about the Persona series before, or maybe heard about Shin Megami Tensei before, and picked this game up just to see what the big deal was. And I think they would still like the game if they gave it a shot, but I think this is a game that has a more actually niche appeal than what it might seem on the surface, and what its success has otherwise demonstrated, because this is either the best-selling or the fastest-selling Atlus game as of right now, which is kind of wild. I mean, it's not wild, it makes sense. Like, with how beloved Persona 3, 4, and 5 are, of course, the newest game by those guys is gonna stomp the sales records. Like, that's just a fact. But, no, I liked Metaphor a lot, and I especially liked its story more than I was expecting to. I think, because a part of me is like, how can you keep telling story that the Personas series has been known for again? I don't think you can. But Metaphor found a way. Not only does it touch on the themes of reject your apathy, like with Persona 3, 4, and 5, I also think it does a lot more with highlighting the importance of fantasy, highlighting the importance of fiction in our lives, being aware of the political landscape and being involved with it, because this is a warning of the dangers of being cynical about the world and not believing in the world being able to be a better place than what it could end up being if we believed more idealistically. This is what I was talking about with Another Crab's Treasure. I feel like both of these games kind of touch on a similar overall cornerstone of a narrative, but both have radically different interpretations of optimism and cynicism. Where, in this case, this is the way more optimistic game, despite how muted and dark and gloomy its color palette is, ironically enough. But overall, yeah, Metaphor was fantastic. I loved it, and it deserves the praise it's been getting. And to be honest, I legitimately believed this probably would have been my game of the year. In fact, I really focused in on Metaphor because I was kind of falling behind, because I did not get to play this game as much throughout the year, or at least since it launched, as much throughout its period as I wanted to. I just didn't get the opportunities, or the mood just didn't feel right, and this is one of those games where I just wanted the mood to feel right when I played it. But it would have gotten to the point where if I didn't just start playing it instead of waiting for the right mood, I would have never finished this game by the end of the year. And if I didn't finish this game by the end of the year, I would not have felt right about nominating it as my GOTY. So that's why I took the last week of the year off of work just to basically play this game. So there was definitely a bit of burnout towards the end there. But again, I think I still agree with all the criticisms I laid out about the dungeons and the repetitiveness and just the overbearing amount of side quests. But I think it all did work in service of the game. Just for Metaphor 2, if there's going to be a Metaphor 2, I want it to be a little bit more diverse. I want it to be a little bit more varied. But I also don't need a sequel to Metaphor. If this is just a one-off thing, I know Atlas has been looking for a third pillar, but I mean, I've said this before about a lot of other game series. I don't know what you could do with a Metaphor 2 that would make it hit as hard or in a different way that's still just as impactful. I don't know. Those game developers at Atlas, they're talented. They could figure it out. And now we come to Pikmin. Pikmin is a game I've not played since I was a very small child. I played Pikmin 3 when I was in high school, around the time that game came out, but Pikmin 1 was a game rental from Blockbuster way back in the day, and that was the last time I played it, probably around the age of like 6 or so. And then Pikmin 2, I just never played before in my life. Actually, a little bit of Pikmin 2 at one point, but basically not enough to have classified me as playing it. Regardless, let's start with Pikmin 1. Pikmin 1 turned out to be better than I was expecting it to be, which was maybe not as surprising as it should have been, because, people rally behind Pikmin. They love this series, the fans of this series. So it is impressive, just how well it holds up today. I played the Switch version for this playthrough of mine. Effectively, this is my first playthrough of the game, and it was surprisingly addicting. What I love about it is the game loop just works so well. There's a lot you can do in a given day, and you have a lot of options, but not that many. So, you have a lot of options, but actually not. You can either focus on gathering ship parts, you can either focus on building your army, you can focus on taking down enemies, you can focus on building up obstacles in the environment so you can take advantage of them later. So there's a lot to go through in this game. And the whole point of the game is that you are stranded on a foreign planet, and in order to escape it, you need to completely rebuild your ship, and you need to amass all 30 ship parts together. And you need to do it by the time 30 days pass, because that's when your life support runs out. So it makes up for a very easy to understand pacing to the game. 30 ship parts, 30 days, and that's all there is to it. So if you can manage to get at least one ship part a day, you're on pace. And if you can get more than that per day, you're ahead of pace. So that's good. And while the game isn't designed to be played in cycles, although it's not designed with that arcadey aspect of getting the high score or reducing the number of days as much as possible. And I don't think it was like outwardly designed to be that way, but I think it was like internally designed to be that way, if that makes sense. I think that playing that way is kind of a natural consequence of the nature the game is, but I think this game can be enjoyed if you're looking to just play a strategy game where you need to manage resources and manage time and plan out your day. I mean, I think the Pikmin series is more of a planning game than a strategy game, if I'm being honest. But the gameplay works. It works so well. This is now one of my favorite GameCube games. The gameplay loop was understandable, it was fun, and I loved it. I don't know, it just worked. Now, Pikmin 2, on the other hand, growing up, I was told, yeah, Pikmin 1, that game kinda sucks actually, but Pikmin 2, that game is way better. And I think I understand where that was coming from, because Pikmin 1 effectively has a time limit. If you don't complete the mission by the time the time limit is done, then you've failed. Although there are multiple endings depending on how many ship parts you get, so there's more of a, or less of a binary win or lose condition in that case. But Pikmin 2 has no such time limit. You can spend however much you want. I mean, you still need to structure, the game's still structured by day, and you need to do everything you want to within a day, but you have unlimited effective days. And because of that, the game is focused more on just gathering treasures and exploring dungeons, and a lot more of a combat focus than the original Pikmin was. And what I appreciate about a sequel, especially when it's on the same console as its predecessor, is when they decide to change up the formula without inherently removing aspects of its design, of its identity, I suppose is the best way to say that. So Pikmin 2, same base mechanics, just a little bit more sprinkled on, but presented and asking you to use them in a completely different way. That being said, while I said growing up I heard that Pikmin 2 was the superior game, over time, it seems that sentiment has completely shifted the opposite way, that now people are looking back on Pikmin 2 and realizing that it wasn't as tightly designed and easily identifiable for its gameplay loop as Pikmin 1. And I also think that the multiple ship captains, although I do appreciate what they were trying to do, I don't think they had the technology at that time to really make use of it. From what I remember of Pikmin 3, it used the 3 captains exceptionally well because of the gamepad, and you could assign orders and track their progress and pick up where they left off on different tasks. So I think that was overall better from memory. Keep in mind it's been more than 10 years since I played Pikmin 3, but Pikmin 2 I think is a lot more clumsy in terms of remembering to switch between captains. So oftentimes I would end up just playing through days only as like Olimar or only as Louis, and then completely forgetting to switch off between them. So I think that could have been better. Maybe if there was like some sort of co-op aspect of the game where there was a player 2 controlling Louis and you could work on tasks together, maybe that would have been better. I'm not sure. Maybe they tried that and it didn't work. Who knows? But overall, I think Pikmin 2 starts out fine, and it's all right and it plays fine, but it is a very chatty game. Like your ship companion just talks forever, and they have something to say about everything, so it really cuts down on the pacing. And what is interesting about like Pikmin 1 is that it would give you a lot of like implicit tutorials through like Olimar's journals at the end of the day, of him noticing different observations, and then you could apply those observations into your own gameplay again, and it kind of makes for like a self-fulfilling like tutorial loop, if that makes sense. Whereas Pikmin 2 is just a lot more direct with, hey, do you see this thing? That's what this is for. So there's a lot less room to experiment and like naturally discover, or even implicitly discover through a more naturally organic tutorial. But otherwise, yeah, Pikmin 2 was fine. It's not a game I heavily desire to go back to. I think I got everything I needed to out of it, and I'm fine with the rest of it. Oh boy, we made it to Prodigal. I love Prodigal. Prodigal is one of the best Zelda games that's not called Zelda. It is an independently developed game, and it came out a few years ago. I came to this one very late. I only learned about it rather recently. But it is very much modeled after, actually, the Oracle's games, or maybe Link's Awakening, depending on how you want to slice it. But it is visually inspired by the Game Boy Advance era adventure game. And it's got dungeons, it's got items, it's got all that aspects to it. But also it's focused more on its setting. It takes place on not an island, but just a singular village. And there's secrets and townsfolk spread all throughout, and most of them are named NPCs who you are recurring characters who you talk to often throughout the game. And while there aren't a lot of items to work with, for example, I think you only get you only get 3 actual different tools to work with. You get your grappling hook, you get your pickaxe, actually. You get your pickaxe, you get your grappling hook, you get a boxing glove to push items aside, and then you get what's called the Dread Hand, which teleports you back to the entrance of a room. But all of them, despite there only being those 4 actually, they're all used together in different ways consistently throughout the entire game, and it makes use of that all throughout. And it finds new ways to keep using them or to challenge you on existing concepts in new ways too. The dungeons in this game are phenomenal, and it is shocking just how hard they get. In fact, to be honest, I think this is some of the post-game, post-launch update dungeons I'm thinking of, but some of these are so complicated and so mind-bending, I had to look up the solution for. They are some of the most difficult dungeons I've ever experienced in a 2D Zelda-like experience. It impressed me just how far they pushed it. And also, the characters are really charming. They've got great facial portrait sprites. You could treat this game as a quasi-dating sim because you can marry one of 8 different characters. And for those who are curious, I ended up marrying Keaton because it just kind of made the most sense. So that's where I stood. But I liked most of them, so I would have been fine marrying any of them. Keaton was just the first one I happened to walk into who proposed to me, so I'm yeah, let's do it. It makes sense. We got some history here that I appreciate. But yeah, there's a lot going on, and I fully recommend this game. It is so charming. It is so good. It is so... right there. How about... You know what? Putting it slightly below Pikmin, because while I love some of the late game dungeons, they do get pretty ridiculous. And also, I guess as a pretty big flaw of this game is the further into the game you get, the less obvious it is for what you need to do to progress. It might just be talk to a random guy or go in or out of the same building multiple times, or it's very obtuse, and I'd recommend keeping a guide on standby at least. I definitely wanted to finish Prodigal this year, though, because its sequel, which I did not know about until it launched, basically, came out as well, and that was Veritus. Veritus takes place about 20-ish years after Prodigal, but for the most part, it has nothing to do with Prodigal's story. It could be treated as standalone. Although I personally wouldn't recommend that, because there is some lore going on in the background that definitely helps if you have played Prodigal before. And it takes a different approach. This isn't an open world game. It is essentially just one massive dungeon, and that's the whole thing. Where Prodigal took me maybe 15 to 20 hours to fully complete, Veritus took me just about 6 or 7 to make it to the end of the game. Now the combat is a bit more tight in Veritus. There's a bit more of interesting tools and fun puzzles. It doesn't get nearly as hard as some of Prodigal's later game dungeons and post-game dungeons, but at least challenges you a lot more sharply in the beginning and keeps up a relative challenge level throughout. Some of the boss fights are actually pretty interesting and fun. The final boss in particular is wild. I'm gonna elect not to spoil it here, but it is it's one of those where I can't believe we're doing this right now. This is awesome moments. But overall, Veritus also didn't surprise me or shock me or fulfill me quite as well as Prodigal did. In fact, it did as much as it needed to. It met my expectations. It did not exceed them. And to be honest, I wasn't expecting it to be as good as Prodigal. I'd say it's somewhere in the B tier. That makes sense to me. Well, I don't know. I don't know about the rankings this year. Maybe we'll, like, at the very end, reevaluate and change them around. But they're nonsense, but the rankings don't matter anyway. Rusted Moss is a Metroidvania all about the grappling hook. This is one of those games where when I was still on Twitter, when it was still called Twitter back in the day, I saw screenshots of it and some videos, and I thought it looked neat as a concept, and I wanted to play it. So I put it on the wish list, I tried it out, I got it this year, and I think the first couple hours are really strong, and they're fun, and as you play around with the grappling hook and the gameplay system, it's pretty neat. The further into the game you go, I think the game becomes less interesting and doesn't evolve on that concept very well. Also, the fact that the grappling hook is very difficult to control. Unless you know exactly how the physics will play out, and you'll only get there by really experimenting with it for a lot of time. Unless you know exactly how the physics are going to work, this is a very unwieldy game to get used to in terms of using the grappling hook. And it's not always reliable, in my opinion at least. That being said, it is a reasonably fun game. The gunplay is alright. It's kind of like a twin-sticky platforming shooter, so there is a little bit more of an emphasis on combat than some other Metroidvanias, for sure. And there is some fun exploration to be had, of course, but to be honest, this is not a game I would glowingly recommend. If you're into it, if it looks interesting, I'd say try it out for a couple hours and then feel ready to drop it whenever you want. I made it to the end of the game. I got just the basic ending. I didn't feel like going around doing anything for a better ending. I think there's like maybe 5 or so endings. I got just the basic ending, and that's all that really mattered to me. That's all I needed. I would put it here, maybe. Sekiro Shadows Die Twice is awesome. A lot of people say this is a Souls-like game. To be honest, I don't really agree. I think this is a completely different flavor from what Souls usually is. What makes this game so distinct is the fact that it's not an RPG. There are some parameters you can upgrade, you can get more health eventually, you can get more strength eventually, but very minimally. It's not going to be enough to make a difference in making you a god or unstoppable. Like, I think, to a certain extent, Dark Souls, when you got a certain build down, or when you got your stats a certain way, or when you got the right armor, enemies can't touch you anymore. But Sekiro, everyone's a threat to you all the time, no matter what. So you gotta get ready to learn its parry system. And the parries feel so good. This is dopamine for parrying the video game, and it feels excellent, and it's awesome. So, yeah, I think this has some of the best combat of any of FromSoft's games that they've developed, at least from the ones I've played. It just feels so good to control. It feels so good to jump around and platform around and use your grappling hook, and you can use like ninja stars and other various tools to aid you, because it's kind of a stealthy game too, or at least you'll get a much better advantage if you stealth it out. But if you want to just go in, sword at the ready, and just parry everything and be a parry god and Makiri counter every enemy that comes at your way, go right ahead. I'm certainly not brave enough for that, but it's excellent. I didn't get to play as much of it this year as I wanted to. Again, just a competition thing, just a timing thing. That's all it was to it. And now we come to Stellar Blade, which I think is a very interesting game for a lot of reasons, chiefly among them being it's a surprisingly polarizing game. This is one of those games where I feel like people will either tell you, oh yeah, this game's pretty good, or this game is soulless trash, and it's bad, and the people who made it should feel bad. Now, to be completely honest, because I am someone who, I wouldn't say I value story over gameplay or gameplay over story. I prefer a nice mix of the two. I don't care about the story in this game. I don't. I do not give a shit about Eve's motivations as a character. I do not give a shit about any of the antagonistic figures or their motivations, but I think the gameplay is fun. I would say it's a flawed game. There is definitely a lot of aspects about this, and I touch on this in the Structured Game of the Year video, where I give this game both the Worst Game Feel Award and the Best Game Feel Award, because there's this weird dichotomy of sometimes when I would open this game up for a session and play it, I would think it's just terrible and loose and poorly designed and just not fun to play. And then there would be other times where I would open this game up and I would think it was genius and fun and one of the best action games I've played in a while, and there was no consistency over whether or not I felt one way or another. It made no sense to me. But regardless, that is how I felt, and that's why I gave it the awards I did in the Game of the Year video. And although I didn't finish this game either, again, lack of time. I wish I had more of it. But this is honestly one of my favorite games of the year. It's just fascinating. And I'm glad that it's a new IP from, not a new studio, but this is the first game from that studio they've made to this scale like this. So I appreciate that aspect of it too. And it's fine when it doesn't feel good. There's way worse games you could be playing than Stellar Blade. This game is not soulless by any stretch of the imagination. I think there's a lot they could work on and improve upon if they make a sequel to this game. That being said, I think they did a pretty dang good job with it. UFO 50 is such a hard game to place in this list, because for those who are unaware of what UFO 50 is, it is a collection of 50 games packaged together, and not like micro games either. These are like, not like fully fledged AAA games, certainly not, but like 50 indie scale, smaller, not bite-sized, but like smaller scale, smaller scope games. If you're aware of the NES game Action 52, the pitch of this game is, what if Action 52 was good and had actually good games in there? So there's a mix between just single-player games, two-player games, multiplayer games, versus games, cooperative games, puzzle games, action games, RPG games, simulation games, board games. There is so many different genres and styles of games, but the way it's framed and laid out is this is a chronological collection of a fictional game developer's development history. So, think of something like an SNK 40th Anniversary Classics compilation version, you know? It's like that, but for a fictional studio. And all the games are made by different various indie game developers who made games like Spelunky and Downwell and things like that. And some of the games in here are phenomenal. Some of them are pieces of shit that I hate. It's kind of a hard game to rank, because do we rank it based on the good games? Do we rank it based on the bad games? Do we take into account that some of the games are purposely meant to be bad because they are showing the growth of this game company and their development? Do we rank it S tier because this game actually has a surprisingly wild story underneath it about the game development studio of this fictional collection, if you look into it? So there's a lot going on here, and I do encourage you to at least look at this game. From a value dollar perspective, this is one of the best bangs for your buck you could ever get. So yeah, play it, I'd suggest. Maybe we'll put it in B tier. Because hey, for every Velbress in the game, there's a Barbuda. That's just what there is to it. Velbress? Valbrace. Valbrace is the one I really like. Valgress is also another one I really like. Magic Garden I also like. The point-and-click one, Dreadhouse? No, Night Manor. Night Manor is also excellent. But yeah, most of them are at least worth playing for a few minutes. But there are a couple in there that you could really sink your teeth into if you wanted to invest time into them. Unicorn Overlord is the one game this year that I really regret I was not able to finish. Now, competition of time. I said it a lot throughout this list, but it's just how it worked out. If I had maybe gotten this game a little bit earlier, if I put more time into it, if I had sacrificed some other games instead to play this one, I would have absolutely finished this game this year. This game is incredible. It is one of the best tactical role-playing games I've ever played. This was a GOTY contender if only I finished it. Now, this game is heavily inspired by the Ogre Battle series of all things, which is a type of strategy RPG we have not seen in a long time. In fact, if I'm not mistaken, we haven't seen a game like Ogre Battle since Ogre Battle 64 all the way back in the day. So to get a game in that style is a lot more refreshing than just a Fire Emblem clone or a Final Fantasy Tactics clone for certain, but also it adds in a lot of, not contemporary features, but features from games that came out afterwards. For example, this game is heavily influenced by Final Fantasy XII's Gambit system, where you can program your party members to do certain actions after other conditions are met based on other party members' actions. It's very confusing, very micromanagey, but if you figure it out, it is satisfying. And also, it is a fully open world strategy RPG. You can tackle missions in basically whatever order you want, and it's incredible. And the story is just whatever. It's basically Fire Emblem 1's plot all over again, which is serviceable. If you're gonna do a strategy RPG story and you don't want to get too ambitious with it, at least do that. Whatever, fine, I can accept that. That's awesome. Sure thing. But yeah, I think maybe this year, Unicorn Overlord is going to be more of a focus game for me. I want to finish that game because that game is really good. If you are into strategy RPGs, that is a game you should play. And now that I think about it, it's actually my first Vanillaware game. I've been aware of the studio ever since Odin Sphere, because Odin Sphere was one of the prettiest games I ever saw in my life at one point, and they kept that style, and they've improved on that style, and Unicorn Overlord looks like every other Vanillaware game, but it's unique and it's incredible and it's its own thing. And I need to give 13 Sentinels a shot one of these days. I need to do that too, but maybe after Unicorn Overlord, one day. Unsighted is also incredible. Holy crap, we got incredible game after incredible game this run. Actually, I'm going to move it up. Yeah, that's fine. That's fair. Unsighted is a Zelda-like Metroidvania, and it's basically crosscode if you're not a little bitch. That's not true. Crosscode is a more directly difficult game. Crosscode will challenge you on actual combat, but what makes Unsighted so unique and so challenging is the fact that it's on a time limit. So your character in the game and every other character for the game has only a certain number of hours remaining. I think you start out with 140, whatever the in-game equivalent of a week is. 168 hours in a week, actually. So you get a week of time, but you can extend that time if you find certain items out in the world that will give you an additional 24 hours. So you can use that on yourself to extend your life beyond your expected lifespan. What you can also do is give those same items to the various NPCs in the world to extend their lifespan. So if there is a shopkeeper that you really like because they offer up great rewards or are great items for sale, or if there is just a character you like in general, or if there's a character that can promise you something if they have the time to do it, that there is a lot of consideration you can put towards giving these different life-extending items towards. So there is a heavy emphasis on time management in this game, which kind of leads into what this game is also about. This is sort of a light speedrunner like training game. If you want to get into speedrunning but you don't know where to start, I think this might be one of the best games you could play to get into that mindset, because this game's going to teach you to play fast. It's going to implicitly teach you to play optimally and route and have a plan for going into how to move around and traverse the world and use your movement tech to the best of your abilities. So it puts you in the mindset and it trains you for that, but it's not explicitly encouraging you to get the best time possible. But also, just in general, if you wanted to, you could disable the time limits and just play this like a normal action-adventure game, which I personally don't recommend. I would recommend people play this game with the creator's intended way of playing with the time limit, because that makes the story, that makes the world what it is. But if you did play that way, you would just see that this is a really good action-adventure Zelda-like game that has great dungeons, that has great combat, that makes you think about the world and traversing in interesting ways, and it's fun. It's just fun. And if you are interested in speedrunning this game, there's even like some of the achievements of this game tutorialize different speedrunning maneuvers and different speedrunning techs and different speedrunning routes. So if you wanted to get into speedrunning and you followed a trophy list, you would start learning how to speedrun, which is really cool. And I'm so looking forward to this studio's next game, which literally looks like Mega Man Legends if it was a Devil May Cry game, and it looks sick. That's most of the reason why I played Unsighted this year, is because that game got announced, and I'm like, holy crap, that game looks incredible. Abyss X Zero or Abyss Zero or something like that. Wishlist it. It looks awesome. Victory Heat Rally is one of the games I found out about really late into the year. Like, I'm talking like a couple weeks before, maybe even like a week before the year ended. So I didn't get very far into it. It's just really charming. It's an excellent arcade-style racer, and it's just got a charming art style. 2D sprites over low-poly 3D environments. That is peak video game art style, if you ask me. So, yeah, game feels good. Probably gets better the more time you spend into it. Just feels nice. That's all. Don't have much more to comment beyond that, though. All right, we're getting into the final stretch. So I kind of said before, made a little joke that, we have a game series that I play through every single year for the channel, and I include on these tier lists. I sort of made a joke about that for Famicom Detective Club, right? But I did not finishing one of those games, so who knows if that counted. But the real game series that we're talking about today that I finished and played all the way through is the Ys series. This is the action-adventure, action-RPG series created by Nihon Falcom, and it was kind of one of those, I wouldn't say accidental, but not intended to be played all the way through until it was. So, I've ordered these games not in chronological order or any particular order, but the order that I played and finished them in. So, to start out, I played through, or I didn't play through, but I started Ys 8 earlier this year, or earlier last year, just to kind of see, but I didn't quite vibe with it, so I set it aside. But then I picked up Ys 6, and the reason I picked up Ys 6 is, I'm even alluding to it all throughout this video, but I want to make video games someday, and I want to make an action RPG, and if I were to make a dream game, it would look kind of something similar to the way Ys 6 looks and plays. So I wanted to play Ys 6 to get an understanding of like what kind of things should I be looking out for, what could I potentially improve upon, what should I not be doing that I think might be a good idea if it's already executed in this game. So I played through Ys 6, and I loved Ys 6. I loved this game a ton. If it weren't for Dark Souls coming out being played this year, and me falling in love with Dark Souls as much as I did, I would probably nominate this as my game of the year that did not come out this year, which might be a bit surprising because I think for a lot of people who are Ys fans, Ys 6 is one of the weaker entries in the series. Maybe not like some of the earlier games that we'll get into, but of the games that you can play right now and their respective remakes, Ys 6 It was the first game to use its particular engine, which would later get refined in games like Oath to Felghana and things like that. So I'm sure maybe those games are better. We're not talking about the remakes for the most part this year. But I don't know what to tell you, man. E6 was fun. It was brisk. It was as long as it needed to be, and it flowed the entire time. Now, there are some problems I do have with it. Chiefly among them, the difficulty will spike up at various points, and the only obvious solution to get past it is to just grind. And that feels real bad. But just fighting enemies is so much fun that, to be honest, I didn't really mind it. And it's not like the game is still that exceptionally long, even with all the grinding either. This is like a 10-hour game. Like a 10-hour RPG. That feels so good. My goodness, I felt like I was making a lot of progress each session I did. And I finished this game in like less than a week. Because it was just that brisk, that fun, and it flowed. And the story was kind of whatever, but it was interesting enough for what it was. And I enjoyed the presence of the various characters, and it was also focused on smaller communities too, since the game takes place on an island instead of a vast roaming continent. So it had its scope in check, and that is one of the strengths of the East series going forward, I noticed, is that, with some exceptions, they are pretty brisk games. But yeah, if you're looking to get into the East series, I would honestly recommend starting with E6, the Ark of Napishtem. The next game I decided to play, instead of going back to 8, I wanted to go back to Ys 1 and 2, the first games in the series, although it might be a bit hard to tell from the box art I chose, but this is the TurboGrafx 16 version of the game. I chose that version in particular because I wanted the best balance between what I thought was authentic to the original PC 88 version, which is very difficult to play, and I'm pretty sure not in English anyway. So I wanted the best balance between authenticity of that, but also the nice quality of life remake features that don't make me feel like I'm playing a PC 88 game. And from my research, it seemed like the TurboGrafx 16 version was the best balance of that. And I think that was the right choice, because although this game is very fast thanks to its upgraded hardware compared to the PC version, it's definitely a game from its time. It uses something called the bump attack system, where instead of a traditional Zelda-like combat where you swing your sword and if your hitbox connects with the enemy's hurtbox, then you do damage, and that's action RPG combat for you. E6, instead, if you run into an enemy, you kind of like simulate a battle, if that makes sense. Where if your stats are higher than the enemies, you'll slowly do more damage to them, or they'll do damage back at you. So the idea is also to either hit enemies from the side, behind, or at least offset from their center point so that their hitbox doesn't immediately register to yours, and then you get to do more damage without getting much retaliation back. Now that being said, I said it was from its time, and you might just assume that's how all action RPGs were back in the day, but the original Ys actually came out after the original Legend of Zelda, to give you a point of comparison for the timing there. I can't speak for the PC 88 and how powerful its hardware was, if it was capable of doing traditional action RPG style combat that we would be more familiar with today and in the later Ys games. But regardless, that's the system it uses. So that's just how it is. And for the most part, it works well enough, and it's not annoying for the first game and a majority of the second game, but towards the end, you kind of just feel it, and it kind of feels monotonous, and I was just wishing it was a more traditionally styled action RPG. And unfortunately, the remakes of these games still use the bump attack system, I guess in a bid to be faithful to the original version, which, while I respect that, I'm kind of curious what an Ys 1 and 2 would look like if it was, for example, closer to Ys 6 or Oath of Felghana. But, yeah, it was fine. It establishes the story of Ys well, and it is a good natural starting point for Adol's journey. I wouldn't say it's strictly necessary to play this game today if you don't want to, but I enjoyed it for what it was. Ys 3, on the other hand, is maybe the worst game in the series. Now, its remake, Oath of Felghana, is usually considered one of the best games in the series from what I've seen, but the original Ys 3, or at least what I played the Super Nintendo version, because that was the easiest one for me to access, it sucks. Ys 3 is going to make me apologize to Zelda 2. Now, Zelda 2 is a game I've given a lot of crap to when I talked about it on these tier list videos, but clearly, I did not realize when playing Zelda 2 just how much could have gone wrong in making a game like that. And the reason I'm comparing Ys 3 to Zelda 2 is because I think they share a very common similarity. They took a predecessor, which was a top-down action-adventure RPG styled game, and turned it into a primarily side-scrolling action RPG. But in Ys 3, the hitboxes suck, the controls feel real bad, you have to grind constantly. If you don't grind constantly, it's game over, buddy, and that's a loss of progress for you inherently. The dungeons are really bad. There's hazards that are hard to avoid. It's not fun. It's one of those games where I rarely enjoyed a second of playing it. Now, to its credit, Ys 3 does have a really good story for what it is, and I think it has a very interesting antagonist, and I think it's funny because while Adol is primarily a silent protagonist throughout the series, towards the end of this game, he actually has spoken lines of dialogue and is actually an active member in the story. I don't know if that was something uniquely a Super Nintendo version thing or if that was intended, but it was kind of nice to have Adol be a character. I don't know. But yeah, Ys 3 was just miserable. It was real bad, and if I'm ever replaying Ys 3 again, you better believe it's going to be through Oath of Felghana. Alright, next up on the list, Lacrimosa of Dana. I came back to that one after finishing the first few Ys games, because many people say that Ys is a series where it's kind of just an anthology, where you don't need to have played all the games in any specific order, and you can jump into any of them at any point because they're all self-contained stories. I partly disagree with that assessment. I think you can. I think you're going to be rewarded a lot more if you play through the series chronologically. Because, for example, Ys 8 starts on a boat, and it's slightly after the events of Ys 5, and you even, during the tutorial battle, get the legendary weapon from Ys 5 to use in the battle. So, I don't know, kind of interesting. But, so yeah, Ys 8 starts out like many other great Ys games do, with Adol indirectly sinking a boat and washing up on shore to a place he's never been before. But you are on a deserted island this time with no ounce of civilization. So a big part of the gameplay loop here is you establish a base with some other survivors, and you need to go out and explore the world, not only to get a lay of the land, not only to forage for materials, but also to find all the other survivors who may have washed on shore, also to discover, or to fend off the monsters that are now threatening you, also to discover more about the actual story, and also just to discover an adventure, just like Adol loves doing. So Ys 6 is highly regarded as one of the best entries in the series. I would say that it has probably the best story in the series, if I'm being fair, and it does have a very accessible gameplay loop. Where I would say this game kind of struggles with is, maybe not struggles is the right word, but something I disagreed with as a fundamental choice is this game makes it very easy to track down side quests and landmarks and points of interest in the world to discover, which is good for a completionist standpoint, which is good because a lot of the side quests in this game have time limits, and if you don't do them by the time limit, they expire and you can never do them again. And not to mention that this game does have multiple endings, and your ending is dependent on how many of the side quests you've completed before the end of the game. But to be honest, I got the true ending of the game on my first playthrough because the game highlights where every single side quest is. It highlights where every landmark is. It's all on your map right away. And it didn't feel like I was exploring an island. It felt like I was following a trail that was laid out for me already. I think the game would have been more compelling if a lot more of that information was hidden, so that you would actually go out and explore and see it for yourself and have that sense of adventure. But whatever, I mean, I guess we love our mindless video games as a community, so whatever. But Ys 8 was pretty good. Its combat was pretty simple. It can get very easy once you just spam skills over and over and over again. Like Force Blade in particular comes out fast, it does a lot of damage, and it costs relatively little SP, so you could spam that over and over again and win most boss fights. Not to mention, there must have been like some kind of bug or something where if I did enough damage to a boss fast enough, for some reason the damage would overflow and I would insta-kill the boss. It was wild, but I didn't complain about it, so I let it happen. But yeah, Ys 8 is not surprisingly one of the better games in the series, in my opinion. I would put it somewhere around there. That makes sense to me. What's not one of the best series is Ys 4 Mask of the Sun. So what makes Ys 4 interesting is there's actually two versions of it. Neither is necessarily the canon version. There is one version that was developed for either the TurboGrafx 16 or the Sega CD. I'm not sure which one. But it was developed for that one by an external company. And then Ys 4 Mask of the Sun was developed by another external company, but is generally considered to be the more canon of the two entries. And that was developed for the Super Nintendo. And a lot of this is just Ys 1 and 2 all over again in terms of structure. It's a bump attack action RPG, so it's not like traditionally styled like Zelda, and I'm a little less forgiving of that this time, which I know that's what the Ys series was originally built on, but for a Super Nintendo game, I was hoping it would be more of a traditional Legend of Zelda Links to the Past style action RPG, where I could swing a sword by pressing a button and it would attack that way. Because the bump attack system, while functional, it can feel unreliable and it can feel like you're not overcoming challenges with your skill alone. But Ys 4 does have a pretty good story. It's got some nice side characters who are involved in your journey, as well as I wouldn't say particularly compelling antagonist, but an antagonist I could understand the motivations of to a certain extent. I just don't think it was very fun to play. In fact, I enjoyed it less than Ys 1 and 2, but I'm going to move Ys 1 and 2 down to C because I'm kind of regretting that one. Yeah, I think the bump attack style is just, it doesn't work for me. It's not what I like. It's not what I enjoy. And if I was making an action RPG, I would not be making a bump style action RPG. Which makes me thankful that the next game in the series was Ys 5, Kefin, the Lost Kingdom of Sand. Maybe it's like caffeine. Ys 5 is kind of what I wanted. It is an action RPG that does not use the bump style attack system anymore. So when you press a button, it swings a sword, or your spear, or your lance, or your greatsword, or whatever. In fact, I don't think there is a lance. I think there's only swords in this game. And also, it is kind of like a prototype Ys 6 in a lot of ways, because there is platforming. You also have a jump button. You have a quasi-magic system. And I think the magic system is kind of neat, because in order to cast a spell, you need to press the trigger repeatedly in order to charge up enough magic power to use it. It kind of reminds me of revving up the, what's the sword from Devil May Cry 4 and 5 that Nero uses? Revving up that sword, Redgrave. It's like revving up the Redgrave and to do a powerful attack. That's what it reminds me of, so I don't know, I kind of like that. But there's platforming, there is combat, traditional combat that I much prefer. Now, where it stumbles is the perspective of a 2D sprite-based game with this 3D logic and geometry is a bit hard to distinguish and hard to tell. So sometimes I might fall when I did not expect to. I might not be hitting enemies because I'm just outside of their hitbox. So it's a bit hard and cumbersome to grasp around that. I also don't think its story is very good either. I just didn't feel any personal connection to what was going on, and I or at least I kind of remember the story of Ys 1, 2, 3, 4, at least somewhat. I don't remember anything of what happens in 5. But what I do appreciate about 5's overall world building is this game introduces the Famicom staple of every NPC has a name and has a place in their respective village and society. So it definitely has that kind of like thumbprint world building stamp that Famicom would later go on to be known for. And it's actually kind of cool that that's in a Super Nintendo game of all things. Or maybe that was just a part of the Eon Genesis translation, I don't know. But regardless, it was fine, and it was at least better than Ys 1 through 5 or 1 through 4, but not an exceptional game either. I know there was a remake for this game on the PS2, only released in Japan if I'm not mistaken. I don't know if that's better. I don't know if it's worse. Who knows? That's not the one I played though. I played the Super Nintendo version. Next up on the list is Ys 7. And Ys 7 I really enjoyed until we started getting into the end game. I think this game, well, first off, this is the first game in the series that introduces multiple party members. And also, I guess I value it slightly above Ys 8, because at least this game is a bit more brisk than Ys 8. Ys 8 definitely gets into a modern trapping of these games need to be super long now. But Ys 7 is a lot more briskly paced. It takes about only 20-ish hours to get through, so it's definitely longer than a lot of the other series up to this point. But it was the first one to introduce multiple party members that you can switch between on the fly, and they all contribute with their own different attack types, which can do vulnerable damage against certain different types of monsters. It's got not an overwhelming number of side quests to do, but it got plenty of side quests. Dungeons are kind of weak, to be honest. I guess dungeons being weak is an Ys staple in general, so whatever. Its story is fine. I didn't have any particular issues with it, but it also, I guess stories aren't really an Ys thing either. These games are just kind of get you into the action, right? But Ys 8 had a better story, whatever. So yeah, that's that. Fun game overall, but at the end it definitely gets pretty fetch questy. It gets pretty, you need to backtrack to all the different areas you already went to. So it can get kind of annoying at the ending, and I kind of put the game down at its like third act for a while because it was just kind of monotonous. But it is a fun game, and I definitely recommend playing it. But then we come to Ys Origins, and Ys Origins is interesting because it is widely considered to be one of the best games in the series. It is widely considered to be one of the best entry points in the series. And to be honest, this was the first Ys game I had ever played years ago, but I didn't get that far because I wasn't feeling the vibe of it. And I still didn't feel the vibe of it, even now. So what makes Ys Origins so unique is, first of all, it is the origins of the Ys series. This is a prequel set approximately 1,000 years, or maybe 100 years, before the events of Ys 1 and 2, and it sets up the events of that game into motion. Prequels are kind of a hard thing to do right because you know how the story inherently ends anyway. So it's hard to stay invested in the story knowing that. But also, just the overall gameplay didn't excite me. Like, it is slightly improved from Ys 6 in terms of its balance and difficulty structure and all that. There's a couple like difficulty spikes that are a little bit annoying and could use some grinding for, but definitely not as frequent or noticeable as Ys 6. That being said, my biggest problem with the game is the fact that you need to play it 3 different times to get the true ending. Well, frankly, first of all, the game has 2 protagonists at the start that you can choose from either. You got Unica, who is kind of more closely in line with Adol in terms of her combat abilities. She is a melee fighter. And then you got Hugo, who is a magic caster that specializes more in long-range abilities. So, 2 different styles of gameplay, and they both have a slightly varied story depending on which one you decide to choose at the start of the game. Only slightly varied though. You still go up the same tower, you still experience the same general pacing of events, you still experience the same boss fights, you still experience most of the same content. So it is kind of tiring to play through the game twice. And after beating the game both times as those characters, spoilers I guess, you get a third character. You get Toval Fat, a fallen warrior who has sided with the demons. And guess what? You still go through the same tower, the same floors, most of the same boss fights, in the same order, more or less. And by that point, I was spent. I was so burnt out on the East series after getting to Toval's campaign in general, all for a story I knew how it was going to end in the first place anyway. So, frankly, despite East's Origins being better than 1 through 5 on a gameplay level, I find it less appealing overall, and I think less fondly of it. I don't know if I can, in good conscience, rank it below all those other games. Maybe if in a slightly different context, if I didn't play all these games back to back, I would have liked it a lot more. And if I spread my 3 playthroughs out over more time, maybe I would have liked that more too. Regardless, I just did not end up liking this game all that much. And then we come to Ys 9, which, to be honest, like I was saying with Ys Origins, I was so burnt out on Ys at this point that I really couldn't be bothered to get very far into this game. I didn't end up finishing it. I was not into it. And frankly, a lot of it too is Ys 9 does a lot of the same gameplay framing as Ys 8 does. There's some cool things about Ys 9. For example, you get like super demon powers that you can use to traverse the world in fun ways. Like you can climb up buildings in an instant and you can fly around. You can grapple up to different points of interest. So there's some fun movement tech, so that's at least different, but it's just Ys 8 again, and I just could not be bothered. And after Ys 7, these games aren't short 10-hour RPGs anymore. You have to really commit to them. So I didn't end up finishing this game. I got bored and I got burnt out. I mean, I at least enjoyed it more than Origins, but I just couldn't bother. And if you notice, Ys 10, the latest entry in the series, which actually released in 2024, is absent from this list because I haven't played it in general, so that's why it's not even here. And with that, nearly 5 hours later, as of recording this, I will definitely be cutting down. There was a lot of dead time and a lot of breaks taken throughout, so it's been longer for me than it has for you, but this is my list of games I've played during 2024. I hope it was enjoyable for you as background noise or whatever else, and I hope to see you all in the next video when I talk about some more games. So I'm signing off for tonight. Have a great rest of your day or night. Thank you for watching.